Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes him pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's fact. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best. I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Welcome to another bonus episode of the Last Round Podcast. This week, we have the other half of the award-winning podcast royalty, Fight Disciples, Nick Peet, a.k.a. The Talent. Thanks for joining me,
Mate, you okay? Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. I'm still reeling from Adam's show last week. So I've come on this week to set a few, correct him on a few things. So I'm sure we'll get onto that a bit later, but it's a pleasure to be here, man. I'm a big fan of your podcast. I listen to it every week, so it's nice to do something a bit transatlantic.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like I touched on with Adam last week. It's good to have your own podcast. You can get on like any guests that you really want, and I thought it'd be kind of good for any aspiring journalists, or really anybody that listens to kind of hear your story from print media, like all the way up to the Fight Disciples. And now I would say kind of the pinnacle, being on TV with BT Sports, if you can just kind of tell us about your journey.
Yeah, well, like everybody, like every young man, really, I'm a failed wannabe sportsman. We all had harbored those dreams of being a sportsman when we were kids. I think most, obviously, sports journalists are, basically guys that were that failed to make it for one reason or another and found a different route. And I'm an absolute cliche in that regard. Played football to a decent level when I was a kid. Did a little bit of boxing, but to be honest with you, it was mostly just to improve my balance on a football pitch. And for a few years there, I was clouded in judgment. I actually thought I was going to be a footballer, and then the realization sunk in my early mid-teens that wasn't going to happen. And then I was kind of like, what am I going to do with my life? Luckily I wasn't too bad academically, so I ended up basically stumbling into a journalism class pretty much at a university college level. It was a brand new class in Liverpool. It had only been going a year or so, and they were short on numbers, and I didn't quite fit in that year. I didn't have enough qualifications, but they let me go on as a trial. And 2 years later, I passed out the course, I qualified the course. But it was literally, I went into a journalism class because I was pretty good at English. I had good English results. And I thought, quite like writing stories, reading, that kind of stuff. I was quite academic in that regard. But sport was my life. I was just obsessed with it. And I just remember chatting to this lecturer about going onto a journalism course. And she was like, well, why don't you just become you can focus on sport. That's obviously a big part of journalism. And it was only at that point when I was like 16, 17 that a light switch went off in my head. And I was like, actually, yeah, that absolutely fits me down to the ground. And pretty much, from that moment, that must have been late 90s. I haven't looked back, and, next thing I was doing a journalism course. The second year of that course meant a 4-day placement, 1 day in college. So I basically signed up to work for the local paper, worked on a free weekly newspaper I was there for about 6 months before I moved on to sport. I was basically, aggressively wanting to get over onto the sports team, as small as it was. And just kind of worked my way up from there, just kind of grafted away. And I remember for the first year I worked there for absolutely free. So I got contacted now by a lot of people wanting to be in my position. A lot of people who contact me on social media saying, I am the biggest boxing fan ever, and you've got a dream job. I want to do your job because I'm a window cleaner, or I'm a delivery driver, or countless other things. And one guy the other week was an accountant, but he's unhappy, hates his life, but he loves boxing, and he wishes he was on TV or making his own podcast. And and it's one of those weird professions, journalism, where it's a bit more like a trade rather than a profession in that regard. I think, yes, there are academic studies, but it's more about nosing the dirt, timing the job, building experience, building your contacts book, and becoming known within the industry. So it's very much like a trade in that regard. It's considered white collar, but it's really a blue collar profession, I think, journalism. And I just got in it then, as I say, starting the weekly newspapers, pretty much got into sports straight away. My two passions in life were boxing and football. pursued that, got onto a regional newspaper, spent some time living in Australia, like most British youngsters do. Went over there for a year, came back, and it was very much both. I was straddling two worlds. I was covering professional football in the Premier League and Champions League, and at the weekend, I was going out and covering professional boxing up and down the UK. So it was normal for me really to be at Anfield on a Wednesday for a Champions League game with Liverpool. Then on the Saturday, be at Goodison Park covering Everton in the Premier League. Then on a Saturday night, driving to Manchester to cover Ricky Hatton boxing. That was a regular week for me for a good long period. And I was at regional newspaper level for a good 10 years. Did loads of other bits of stuff, bits on Sky and bits on TV here and there, but nothing salaried or nothing regular. And just basically put the work in at that level. And I think that's what a lot of people don't see now. They see the TV bits, they listen to the podcast, and there's 22 years of actual graft, actual driving up and down the UK, flying all over the world. I've been super lucky, don't get me wrong. I've covered fights pretty much on all over Europe, obviously on both, over the Atlantic, Australia. I've been really fortunate in that regard. But it's like anything in life. I think you make your own luck in any kind of game, and being there and grafting and going to Lee Leisure Centre where there's 300 people to watch a club show on a Tuesday night in the pissing down rain in December. You've got to be as committed to doing that as you are to going to cover Anthony Joshua at Wembley Stadium. And I think people don't realise that there is a lot of graft that goes into it. But yeah, that's pretty much how I started out. I stumbled into journalism. Absolutely was made to be a journalist. I know that now looking back. And did 10 years at regional level before I progressed on to the next step.
Are you a firm believer, Nick, that some of the media guys should really cut their teeth at like the amateur level and the small hall shows? Because a lot of people now, like we did, you can make your own podcast, you can make your own website, and it's fairly easy to get credentialed to some of the big fights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a lot of ways, it's crazy that people can have, bedroom operations and have a bigger pull than national newspapers, but that's actually happening right now all over the world, and that's just the world we live in. And, whether you point the fingers at national newspapers for not seeing that and not accepting that growth, I was at newspaper level, and the internet was a relatively new thing then. It was, when it first kind of got big. And I remember, the guy who was chosen to be like the web editor, that was like the fucking lowest job in the office. That wasn't a premier position. That was like some guy who's just basically trained and, all right, they've made him the web editor. And it was like, oh, all right, have they? Yeah, cool. Whereas now, in hindsight, that should have been the fucking best job in the building. I'm sure it probably is now at most newspapers. I think the web editor now is probably one of the most important guys in the newsroom. But, back in the late 90s, certainly in the noughties, the web team were the lowest of the low. They were just cutting and pasting copy from what was in yesterday's newspaper or whatever. The world has absolutely changed right now. I don't think national newspapers and in a lot of ways magazines, like I did 6 years working at Fighters Only, which was a magazine that was sold all over the world. It was translated into 4 different languages just to piece that together. So I left the Liverpool Echo. What year did I leave the Echo? I think I did 10 years there. So I left the Liverpool Echo about 2010 and I moved to London then. And I worked at Boxing News in London, which was like a dream of mine because, being a boxing fan and a boxing journalist for a decade and rubbing shoulders with all the guys from Boxing News and just with it being an institution, that magazine, for anyone that doesn't know, Boxing News has been going longer than Ring Magazine. It's based here in the UK, but it's a far better magazine, in my opinion. It's an absolute institution. So to spend time at Boxing News was incredibly valuable in my career and really felt like a bit of a career pinnacle. But I'm a northern lad and I fucking hated London. I hated living down there. I just couldn't take to London at all. It's funny. Some capital cities, I lived in Sydney for a while. I ended up moving out into the suburbs when I was in Australia. I like New York. The times I've been to New York, I love it, but I prefer to stay in Brooklyn. The times I've been to LA, You know, I found myself going more to the suburbs as well, rather than staying right in the centre of the city and stuff. It's weird. I don't know what that is about me, but London, I could just never take to it. And it's just so outrageously expensive compared to what the house prices and living costs are in the north of England, as you well know. London was just extortionate. So while it was my dream job, going back to live like I did when I was a student, literally eating pot noodles and, you know, drinking beer every night and having no savings and no future, and I just couldn't take to it. And it broke my heart to do it, but I left London less than 6 months of being down there. But I was really fortunate enough that I got a position, actually, a big step forward, a big promotion in my professional career, because I got the position of editor-in-chief of Fighters Only. Fighters Only is the biggest MMA magazine in the world, or certainly was at the time. Big sales in North America, US, Canada, obviously huge sales in the UK, across Europe. We translated into Spanish for the Mexican audience. So we had big sales down in Mexico as well. And we had a German edition of the magazine, a South African edition of the magazine. And I was kind of overseeing all that, as well as, for 6 years there, I was basically pulling the strings behind the scenes for the World MMA Awards, which are basically the Oscars for the sport of MMA. All the UFC stars are there. It's held in Las Vegas every year. And my role was very much to do the shortlists for every single award every year, to put the voting together, to build a voting panel of ex-fighters to choose the shortlists on 12, 13 awards, which the public would then vote on an interactive website. There was so much work that went into it, but obviously I got a ton of experience in that field. And that was the first time really I'd spent those 10 years at regional level covering football. Then I dropped the football and was just boxing editor for a long time. And then when MMA really picked up in the UK, certainly the UFC, we got a couple of guys in the UFC. I started covering UFC as well. And then I dropped UFC when I moved to Boxing News. But then after Boxing News, I went and just did UFC full time, did 6 years of UFC coverage and dipped in and out of the boxing, which led us then on to 2016, which is when I met Adam and we started Fight Disciples. And a year later, I walked into the owners of Fighters Only and said, listen, that's me done. I'm going to go and do my own brand and my own thing now. And thankfully, 4 years later, it looked like it's been a pretty good decision.
When you were the editor-in-chief for Fighters Only, how was the coverage with the UFC? Because obviously Dana White seems to, pick and choose all the media access.
It was absolutely sensational. And I'll tell you why. Because this is a story that has been told before. So, I'm not stepping on anyone's toes here. But the owner of Fighters Only is a British guy. And he was in magazines in a different field, and then he started training MMA. He started, he really got into the sport massive, and he realized there was no glossy, high quality GQ style magazine for the sport of mixed martial arts. There was there was a few little pamphletty versions here on both sides of the Atlantic in the US and over in the UK, but nothing really that did give the sport justice. Nothing that really, was of substance. And critically, he did the right thing because he put all the infrastructure behind it. He contacted the UFC and he said, listen, I'm putting a shed load of my money into starting this magazine and I want you to support it. And it's going to be a glossy. I'm going to sell it in the UK. We're going to sell it in America. And we are going to champion your sport. And we're going to champion, obviously, the UFC, the Champions League of the sport. And the UFC came back to him. I don't know if it was Dana White, actually Dana that came back, or one of the lawyers or whatever. But this was going back a good 20 years now, a good 15, 20 years now. So the UFC was very much a fledgling company then. And they wrote back and said, yeah, we'll support you. We'll provide you with images. We'll help you get interviews with all our guys. Can we just ask one favor of you? You're calling your magazine The Ultimate Fighter. Can you change the name? Because we are launching a TV show called The Ultimate Fighter, which is a huge part of our business moving forward. But we haven't got the name trademarked in the UK or Europe. So you could use that name, but we are asking you not to use it because we are going to roll out this TV show called The Ultimate Fighter. That's a true story. And the owner, Rob, at the time went, of course, no problem. He went and, chose a new name, chose the name Fighters Only. And I think that moment very much solidified Fighters Only's relationship with the UFC. because they could have used that name or, you know, made it difficult for the UFC or whatever, but they didn't. And I think from that point on, Rob, the owner, has always had a great relationship with Dana White, and we always had incredible access, and that helped us build. You know, at one stage, Fighters Only was, you know, the magazine sales that we were doing were fucking absolutely unreal, and it really felt every time you contact a fighter, it really felt like it was prestigious for them as well to be on the cover of Fighters Only. It was a real like landmark moment in their career as well. It was a really exciting time to be a part of the UFC because, you know, it was by then, by the time I joined, you know, it was 6-7 years after the Ultimate Fighter's success. So it really was at fever pitch in terms of the growth and the amount of money in the sport. And the beauty of it then as well, there was so many other brands involved because this was before the Reebok deal. So you had RDX and Bad Boy and, you know, so many MMA specific brands. So it was a real like community, you know, it was a really exciting time to be a part of the sport.
Do you think the Reebok deals kind of killed fighters' personalities?
Yeah, I think so. Listen, Dana loves it. You know, that's what Dana's all about because if you think about what Lorenzo at Fertitas and Dana set out to do originally, they love boxing. They're the biggest boxing fans out there. They love fight sports, of course, but they realize that boxing's got so many issues because of politics, too many promoters, too many TV channels, too many organizations with belts, as we well know. You know, they are the fundamental issues of boxing as a sport. So they decided that MMA and the way they were going to build the UFC was to follow the NFL or the NHL, you know, or the sports that are American-based sports where they own the fighters and then the clubs kind of feed off them. It's all kind of in-house. And in many ways, of course, that's been hugely successful and it's absolutely worked. You know, certainly over the last few months during the pandemic, boxing didn't have the finances to be able to put in the precautions and the COVID testing and flying people on private jets all over the world to make events happen. But because the UFC, the way it's set up, because they own the fighters pretty much, even though they're all subcontractors, they own the game. It's allowed them to have the finances to be able to do this, and this. So, you know, there's in that regard, it's been a huge benefit. But of course, you know, there's also a downside to that, and that's the fact the fighters don't get the paydays they probably deserve. Certainly, the paydays that their boxing counterparts do.
Can you remember the first fighter you interviewed, Nick?
Oh shit! First one at regional level, so you're going back to 98, 99, would have been Tony Dodson. He was a Liverpool boxer. He went on to become British champion, Tony. But I first interviewed him when he come back from the Junior Olympics in Michigan. He went over to the USA, won a gold medal at the Junior Olympics, came back to Liverpool, and he was one of the first people I ever interviewed. And then, obviously, we're still friends now. We're still a good mate of mine, Tony. And following his career, I got so much pleasure from following his career just because I knew him on a personal level. I knew his family. You know, I knew everything about him. And similarly, you know, following Tony Bellew throughout his entire career. Now, me and Tony grew up in the same neighborhood. We went to the same school. His older brother was in my class in school. You know, we played for the same amateur football team. We went to the same, or a lot of his friends, we went to the same junior school. We were all in the same high school together. Like, I've known Tony Bellew literally since he was 13 years old. And that has been super exciting because of all the boxers I've followed from that age, you know, so pretty much anybody that's been from Liverpool or Manchester during the late 90s through the noughties in their amateur career, coming into the 2010s as pros. So you're talking the Smith brothers, the Anthony Crollers of this world, you know, Derry Matthews was a brilliant ride from a Liverpool journalist point of view. You know, those are the guys that I was there when they were in schoolboy finals. I was there when Tony Bellew had like his 4th ever fight as an amateur, when he was just he looked like a big fat baby, you know, completely bald head, little fat kid. You know, I remember Bellew weighing in to go into the novice, I think it was the novice senior ABAs, which is like basically the UK version of the Golden Gloves, national championships. And he was having to eat up to heavyweight. And he was eating a fucking KFC bucket the night before the weigh-ins to try and prove to everyone he could fight as a heavyweight. By the way, he knocked everybody out in that tournament and won the novice championships, and so to be there with Bellew from that point all the way through to the David Haye 2 fights, to the Alexander Usyk, his final ever fight, being on that journey with him has probably been the most rewarding journey of my professional career, just because I know him on a personal level. I spoke to him just the other day. We play football now, five-a-side every now and again. I went to his wedding. I remember going to Tony Bellew's house when he lived in basically a council house in Old Swan, not a great area of Liverpool. He was working in a pillow factory, stacking boxes while he was training as an amateur boxer. He just turned pro then. He broke both his hands in a fight. And I remember being there with him, Rachel. I think they'd had their second son by then as well. And this was a guy with 2 broken hands, no source of income, couldn't work in the factory. His boxing career was like, where's it moving forward? He was only getting hundreds of pounds per fight anyway. Literally, where is the next meal going to come on the table for this family? To be on a journey with him and to see him fight David Haye the second time for the riches that he got for that fight, absolutely, that's probably the most rewarding journey I've been on.
He actually fought someone I went to school with, Bob Adjusafe.
Really? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I went to school with him.
So the Bob Adjusafe fight, was that 2010? Well, it was a Frank Warren dinner show.
It was what Bob dropped him, didn't he? It was in Liverpool, and it was the first time Tony had got dropped.
Which is the one he got dropped in? Because he definitely got dropped in one.
He got dropped, and then it went to points.
Ah, right. Okay, they had the rematch straight away.
No, that was Ovil Mackenzie, wasn't it?
Bob Adjusafe. I don't think that was in Liverpool. Bob Adjusafe. I thought that was 2010. Bob Adjusafe 2010. Yeah, it was. So the Bob Adjusafe fight, I was at that fight. So Bob Adjusafe was in London. It was at the Mayfair Hotel in London.
Okay.
And Bob dropped him in the 4th round. And it was a heavy knockdown as well. Like Bellew's head slapped the floor. And Bellew bounced back up. And the reason I remember that fight clearly, the night before, so that was on a Friday night, I think. On the Thursday, I'd been let go from my job at the newspaper. They literally put me on garden leave. There was a big issue, load of bollocks, and I'd basically been let go on the Thursday. And I went to cover Bellew in London on the Friday night with nowhere to put my copy on the Monday morning because I'd been basically let go. I didn't want to tell anyone. I didn't know what to do, but my life had been boxing for best part of 12 years, going to the events every weekend. So when I got basically fired on the Thursday, I went to see Bellew in London on the Friday with me notepad and pen, thinking, I've got nowhere to put this. But I sat on a dinner table and with all the journalists. And the reason I remember that fight vividly is I sat at that table and basically said to all the guys, I think Steve Lillis was there, Tris Dixon had been there, Gareth A. Davies, Stevie Bunce, all the usuals, all the press pack, Ron Lewis. And I remember telling them over dinner and just saying, listen, I just got let go by the Liverpool Echo yesterday. I'm here to cover Bellew. I don't know where the copy's going to go. I haven't even got a job. I've got to find a job on Monday. And literally over that table, while Bellew was picking himself up off the floor against Bob Adjusafe, Tris Dixon moved around the table and said, can you move to London on Monday and start at Boxing News on Monday? And that's exactly what happened. I drove back to Liverpool with Bellew on the Friday night, Bellew and his dad. I packed up my flat in Liverpool on the Saturday and Sunday, and I got the train down to London on the Sunday night, and I started in Boxing News on the Monday morning, which is why I knew that fight was in London. I knew that it was 2010 in London, and because it was just a massive moment in my career as well, yeah. No way. So you went to school with Bob, yeah?
Yeah, he was a year older than me, yeah.
Wow. Mental.
Yeah, small world.
It is, yeah. Absolutely it is. Absolutely.
For all the up-and-coming journalists, Nick, how do you recommend, building those relationships with fighters? Because obviously, Tony Bellew well, Darren Till, Dan Hardy, Molly McCann.
The best thing, listen, I had some good advice years ago. Was it Sid Dye, an old journalist from Liverpool? We'd passed. He was the old boxing reporter from Liverpool years before I'd started there, and I had a conversation with him, and he said, it's great that you're forming relationships, and that's key. Forming relationships is key, certainly with gyms, with fighters, that connection. But you've always got to remember that on their bad days, you've got to say that as well. You've got to tell the truth. You know, you can't sugarcoat it. You've got to be able to look them in the face and criticize them. And what I found over the years was, yes, there's been one or two incidents. You know, 22 years, you've got to ruffle a few feathers, otherwise you're not doing your job. You know, you're not being honest to yourself. And I've fallen out with half a dozen fighters, but I could, you know, in fact, I can't even count on any fingers the number that I never made up with. Some of them it took days, some of them it took weeks, some of them it took years. But everyone I've ever interviewed, written about, talked about, certainly interacted with, I feel like now I could pick the phone up to anybody. And I've criticized them all. You know, I've criticized them for bad performances. I've criticized them for not taking their careers seriously. I think true professionals, if you're writing honestly and you're speaking the truth about them, they know deep down inside that you're speaking the truth. You know, I would never... listen, my thing on BT at the moment, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, is to be the guy, the loud guy, the rowdy guy, to bring the energy and say stuff that I believe, but I just turn the volume up on it. It's different with writing, because I feel like when you write something, it feels like it's a lot. It's weird. It's an old school mentality, but it feels like once you put it down on paper, in print, it lasts forever. You know, which is actually, it's probably the opposite. It's tomorrow's fish and chip paper is the old cliche. But for some reason on paper, it feels like it needs to be a lot more thought through, a lot more constructive, you know, a lot more, have a lot more depth to it. So I used to literally stay up all night, rewriting copy sometimes and trying to get specific words just right for that exact reason. TV and radio works very differently. But I feel like every time I criticize the fighter, it was always substantiated. I never felt like I've never had a go at anybody deliberately. Listen, I was in a favourable position that I spent 10 years at regional level, and you work out at regional level that you're there to, as much as, and it's great because I cover fight sports, because this is a fundamental part of it. When you write at regional level, when you're a regional journalist covering a LA or New York or whatever, your job is to support the New York teams. Your job is to give the readers what they want. You know, there's no good writing a whole report about, you know, a boxer from Liverpool who's just had a 12-round war with a boxer from, you know, the other side of the world, and criticizing the boxer for Liverpool for making it hard for himself or whatever it may be. You know, you've got to realize what your audience is. You've got to realize that your people are buying that newspaper to read about their guy, and there's always going to be that affinity there. So I learned pretty early on, covering football and boxing, that who my audience was, and to cater for that audience. And that's not to be a patsy for that audience, but to, you know, hold the mirror up to ourselves rather than look outwards, you know, never kind of attack your own. And that set me in good stead for covering fight sports, because, you know, one thing that I'll hold my hand up and admit to is that I'm a lover of the fight game. Boxing and MMA, I make my living doing it. This is how I put a roof over my head, pay a mortgage, send my kids to school, put food on the table, all the cliches. This is how I make a living. I am a fan first and foremost. I want both sports to succeed. I want fight sports to become as popular as soccer. I want everyone to talk about fight sports, be involved in fight sports, to love fight sports. For that reason, I will genuinely champion the more marquee names. I will get behind guys who I think, this guy's pushing the needle, this guy's making people tune in. That's not to say, listen, everybody loves picking out a guy from the crowd and going, watch him in the future. And then that guy comes to fruition and really, you know, like Darren Till. We were on the Darren Till hype train when, you know, before he even got into the UFC. We were on, you know, the Devin Haney hype train when most people in the UK didn't even know who he was. Likewise, you know, Adam likes to remind everybody that he's been talking about Teofimo Lopez for the last 4 or 5 years. Nobody in the UK was talking about Teofimo Lopez back then. So there's certainly a beauty in that. But knowing that your audience, who they are, they're fight fans, they're coming here to talk about fighting. So I always try and be positive. I always try and remain as positive as possible. So I think for that reason, the boxers and the fighters that I deal with. Good night, Liv. You okay? Baby going to bed. The fighters that because fighters realize, and this is one of the reasons why I focused on fight sports over boxing, over football in the first place. Anyway, it was because boxers realize the value of media, the value of support. You know, it's not like soccer. You can't just turn up on a football pitch because you're playing Man United and, 150 million people around the world are going to watch. You've got to generate interest. And you are your own marketing tool. If you're a fighter, you've got to sell yourself. So I think fighters realize that I've got a good energy and I'm there for them. I'm there to support them. If ever I'm doing an interview, I'll always try and speak to the fighter. If I can't speak to him beforehand, I'll always try and get a message to him and go, come with your own agenda. You come, don't wait for me to point you in a direction. Come with your own agenda. I'm providing you with a platform to sell you, to sell your next fight, to get people interested in you. My job is to get people to connect with you. So my job is to get behind the scenes and not talk about all the usual stuff. Talk about your life, your family, what your passions are, everything else. That's my job, is to get that out of you, show you in a different light to people. But absolutely, use the opportunity that you've got. Use the tea chest in front of you to sing as loud as you can about you, to sell you, to promote you, to bring people to this sport. Because fundamentally, that's what we all want to do. We all want to live our happiest lives, and I'm never happier than when I'm cage side or ringside. That is when I am happiest. And the fact that that's my job just is absolutely the silver lining. I literally couldn't be living a better life if I've tried. I'm so happy at home and professionally. It's absolutely where I want it to be right now. So, of course, I'm always going to try and stay positive. I'm always going to try and champion the guys. I'm always going to try and support them. And that's why I will always give Conor McGregor as much opportunities as possible to come back and to get back involved in the sport. I'll always champion guys like Billy Joe Saunders, man. The guy's a walking, talking nightmare. His social media, he's his own worst enemy. He shouldn't have a social media. If I was around, if I was his mate, I wouldn't let him have a social media. But fundamentally, when he boxes, that's what Billy Joe was put on this planet to do. He's a sensational boxer. Just box. I just want him to be a boxer. Let's just let him do that. And if I can help in some way by doing a great interview with Billy Joe that people connect with and people see him in a different light and want to support him and want to buy him a ticket, I feel like that's me doing my job. Great, man. Yeah, come on board.
Nick, for people that want to follow in your footsteps, do you recommend them, go into an interview with like a stack of questions ready to go? Or do you recommend just coming with an opening and then just kind of letting the interview naturally just unfold?
Yeah, like yesterday, I spent like 3 hours hanging out with Darren Till. And as soon as he said, come to mine, it's 9 o'clock at night, I thought, by the time I get set up, it's going to be 10 o'clock. I know he's out of camp at the moment. I know his coach has told him to go and, chill out, have a couple of beers or whatever. And a couple of beers means literally 1 or 2 beers. But I thought, I ain't getting out of here before midnight. I knew we were just going to kick back. It was going to be super laid back. And that's a very different interview from one that you would get, say, at a press junket or on a media week, of course. But I never, ever prep in terms of structured questions. I will just have 4 or 5 subjects where I want to get to in my mind. So I never wrote anything down yesterday. But I knew, of course, I wanted to, because it was such a non-fight environment. I knew the last thing I wanted to speak to him about was fighting. I knew it was my opportunity to talk to him about COVID lockdown. How's that been treating him? What's he been up to? How does he feel about it? How is the UK dealing with it? His injuries. He was climbing a mountain 10 days after he said he'd absolutely ruptured his knee ligaments. What was he doing climbing a mountain? What was it actually like climbing a mountain with ruptured knee ligaments? What did he get from it? All that kind of stuff. There's loads of juice with tell because of he lived in Brazil and everything else. And there's so many narratives with him. And I've actually known Colin Heron, Darren Till's coach, for the full 22 years I've been an active journalist, because even when I was training and I was working on that weekly newspaper, one of the familiar faces that came in was Colin Heron, who was a Muay Thai coach at the time, with his latest star who was going to Thailand to fight for titles. So I was writing about his fighters at a weekly newspaper level 2 decades ago. So I've got a real good bond and a real good connection with Colin. It's been a pleasure to follow his fighters go on and compete at the highest level. Again, it's just one of those weird situations where a guy that came in with a 12-year-old kid who he's taken to Thailand to fight Muay Thai, to fight against a Thai guy that I at the time, of course, you're like, yeah, whatever, no problem. You know, let's take a picture and all that kind of stuff. To think 2 decades later, he would be the most successful coach in the UK in terms of the number of fighters who've got to the UFC, the most successful MMA coach in the UK. And this was a guy that was on my doorstep. I trained at Calbon myself. I trained there for 2 years, trained Muay Thai there for 2 years. I've got such an affinity with that brand. It's just one of those weird things where you go like Bellew and Dodson and all these little things that you think at schoolboy level, at such a low level. And then to be in Vegas with these people, to be at the O2 in sold out arenas with these people, absolutely mental but just a similar work ethic. I think that's probably why we've got the same, that's why we all get on so well. You know, if you said I had 10% of the work ethic of Tony Bellew, I'd take that as a compliment. Put it that way. There's a reason why he's been so successful, because I've never met anybody with the work ethic of Tony Bellew.
When you were starting in the game, was there any interviews you were nervous for? Because, you know, they're big names. It's the job that you always wanted to do. So there was kind of a lot riding on it.
Yeah. Yes and no. More excitement than anything else. More excitement that I was going to, you know, get those big interviews. You know, I've been lucky enough to interview Mike Tyson a couple of times. I've been lucky enough to, you know, be in Vegas for big fights around Ricky Hatton. I did Ricky Hatton against Pacquiao. I did Ricky Hatton against Mayweather. I did Mayweather versus Shane Mosley. You know, and I was very much a British journalist at the time, but I had a great relationship with one of the team at Golden Boy, and one of the girls at Mayweather, and I was able to get real good press pass access for a good few years over into Vegas. And then so I've been around big fighters, you know, those 90s noughties period, you know, I was basically doing the UK beat. So even though I was mostly covering fighters from the Northwest, those fighters were on NAS undercards. You know, it was Ricky Hatton's entire career. You know, these are huge fights. So you had Thomas Hearns fighting on NAS undercards, or the artist formerly known as Thomas Hearns. And then, you know, I got into a routine of doing a lot of after dinner stuff as well, where I do interviews. So I got to meet Sugar Ray Leonard on more than one occasion. I got to meet Roberto Duran on more than one occasion. You know, people bringing them over to the UK. John H. Stracey, the former WBC champion who lives not far from me, he used to bring a lot of the fighters over from the WBC convention, and I would do a Q&A live on stage with them, and did that for a few years. So I've been used to being around absolute legends, so it never really intimidated me. Listen, at one time I got to interview Kenny Dalglish as a Liverpool fan, to interview the King. Obviously, that was nerve-wracking. I probably fell apart then. But what I've found with interviews is, and the best advice I can give is, you know it. I know the industry. I know the market. I know what I'm talking about. This is my passion. This is what I love. This is my life. I don't need to go away and prepare questions because someone's going to pay me to sit next to Sugar Ray Leonard, have dinner with Sugar Ray Leonard, and then spend 20 minutes or an hour, 20 minutes interview him, and then 40 minutes hosting a Q&A with the rest of the audience. I adore Sugar Ray Leonard. He's one of my heroes. So I don't need to research, you know, how he put weight on to fight Hagler, or, you know, the first fight with Hearns and what happened here and his personal life. I've read his books, and I think that more than anything, it's about just having the confidence to go into a conversation without the questions always makes it more fluid. I find if you do structured questions, or I've seen people at press junkets with an iPad and they've got 10 questions on, and then they'll ask a question and you'll be standing right behind them and they'll ask a question and they'll get not the answer they were expecting, but an even better answer. An answer which has left the door wide open to follow up on. And the journalist is not listening because he's so, or the journalist, the person who's doing the interview is not listening because he's so obsessed with getting his next question out right that he hasn't twigged on to what the fighter has just said. He's just opened the door for you. He's just told you about something there that I've never heard before. There's your in. Throw your iPad away. Follow up on what he's just said. Listen. And I don't want to repeat what Adam said because I know he was. This was a big thing he was pushing last week when you spoke to him. But that is the ultimate thing you can do as an interviewer. Listen to what the guy or the girl is saying or wants to say. And always, like, my other thing is, like I got to interview Khabib Nurmagomedov last year. Obviously, huge role model for Muslims all over the world, not just for Russians, but Muslims all over the world. You know, he's a devout Muslim, and you know he's very serious about his religion, his family. Is, you know, it's fundamental to who he is as an individual. Now, me, of course, being a Liverpool fan, a season ticket holder, my idol Mo Salah, Sadio Mane, you know, there's quite a few Muslim players in the Liverpool first team squad, and you know, I knew that Khabib was a football fan. I know in the past he'd spoken about being at a Real Madrid match. So I went to interview Khabib ahead of the Dustin Poirier fight in Abu Dhabi. Spent about 20 minutes talking football with him. And it completely, because Khabib's one of those individuals as well that, you know, I'm sure people have seen him do many interviews. He can be quite frosty, or at least come across as frosty. You know, maybe it's part of that Dagestani, just the way they are. You know, they travel in packs. You know, they've got a certain order about them that you wouldn't want to mess with it with a group of Dagestani men. Of course not. You know, everyone from Dagestan can apparently fight. So your job as the interviewer is to break him out of that as quickly as possible. The worst thing you can do is sit down with Khabib and go, so tell me, Conor McGregor, you're going to do the rematch? Because he may as well get up and walk out. You've lost him already. You've lost him at your first question. Or your last thing you want to do is hit him with this question that he's just had off 50 other journalists outside. You know, I still can't believe you go to these press events and people say, have you had a good camp? Who've you been sparring? How's your weight? Like they should be questioned. It's like when you get in the back of a taxi, you know, have you been on long, mate? What time are you knocking off? You know, all them bog standard questions. The small talk you have with cab drivers, or you know, they're the same questions that should be banned at press events. You know, I would love a fighter one day to just turn around and go, yeah, I've had the worst camp ever, to be honest with you. I think I'm going to get knocked out tomorrow. I would love them to say that, because it would throw the journalist off. But again, you can't call people journalists, because that's not journalism. Your job as a journalist, or, you know, somebody who's presenting themselves as a journalist, is to go away, do your research, and go into an interview with the confidence to be able to take it off track, because I guarantee that is when you get the gold. That's when you get the best stuff.
You've been around, obviously, the fight game for many years. Where's the strangest place you've conducted an interview? Because we have that famous one with Michelle Joy Phelps where she interviewed Tyson Fury in bed. That was pretty out there.
I interviewed Mike Tyson in a lift in Manchester. And it literally was the lift journey was the duration of the interview, and then me running behind him with his burly bodyguards trying to wave a little dictaphone at him. That was pretty strange. Over the years, because of my closeness to a lot of the Liverpool and Manchester boxers, especially, you know, I've done stuff at parties, in fucking shower blocks. You know, my big thing, I'd still love to do it as well, and I may well do it one day, is I want to get a GoPro and interview a fighter while I take them on the pads. That's my big thing. I want to mic us both up, take someone on the pads while I do the interview. That's one. I've still got to try and work that out at the moment, to trying to find the right fighter. You know, because there's a few out there that would let that would let rip a little bit. So I've got to find the right person for that. But I would love to do that. But I once sat up till about 5 a.m. waiting to interview a UFC fighter, and it was for the front cover of Fighters Only, and it was Chris Weidman, and it was not long after he'd beat Anderson Silva. It was the first fight, so he'd knocked Anderson Silva out. We were in Vegas for that fight. I spoke to him afterwards, said, listen, you've got to be on the next cover of the Fighters Only. We'll make the interview happen. We'll do it away from here when you've had time to reflect, no problem. And I waited up till 5 o'clock in the morning. It'd been days, and I'd been waiting for days. And then it was literally like we put pressure on the management and said, listen, it's got to be tonight. We're going to print tomorrow. I will do the interview, write it up, and it will go to the print press tomorrow. It can't be any later. Please help us. And I'd sat up literally waiting by a phone till 5 a.m. And then I eventually got a phone call. And Chris Weidman, give him his due, he was at a wedding in Hawaii. And I think it was either his sister or his brother. I'm leaning towards his sister now, but it was a close family sibling. And he was in Hawaii with his family at his brother or sister's wedding. And he broke away from the reception at the wedding to walk down the beach with a mobile phone and spend 40 minutes on the phone to me for a Fighters Only cover. And from that moment on, he was put on a pedestal. as far as I was concerned. I've always been I couldn't admire him anymore for that because, yes, the argument is he could have done it a week earlier. It'd been a lot easier. But when it got to he could easily have just blew that off and I've had to just write a colour piece. But he didn't. He was standing on a beach in Hawaii. I was sitting in a bed sit in Newcastle at 5 o'clock in the morning, pretty much on the other side of the planet. And we were conducting this interview for the cover of a magazine that went to print just hours later. So that was a pretty bonkers one.
It's crazy how accommodating fighters are compared to other sports. Obviously, you covered, the Premier League. And I imagine just the difference in access must be incredible.
Yeah. Well, this is, again, one of the reasons why I stopped covering football. And listen, I covered Liverpool in a Champions League final. I was at Istanbul as a fan. Still, just make sure my wife can't hear this. Still the greatest 3 days of my life. Istanbul, Liverpool, European Cup number 5. And then it was at the European Cup final a couple of years later as a journalist in the press box covering it when we lost 2 years later in Athens. So, I covered football at the very highest level. But what I got sick of happening was being at the game post-match, and they used to make us crowd in a huddle. And it was basically the exits from the players' dressing room to basically where their cars were parked on the other side of the grounds. They had this tunnel, this walkway. And the players would have to walk past all the journalists to basically leave the stadium. And it was kind of up to them whether they stopped or not. But, you're standing there as a grown man asking someone who's, yes, he's a gifted athlete, of course he is. And some of them were on 50, 150, 200 grand a week, whatever it was at the time. You're saying any chance of an interview. And it was the same faces that would just, not even turn you down, Mike, but certain ones would, as if you weren't even there, they would look in another direction. Another one was players that would, Glenn Johnson used, because I can call him out, I don't give a fuck. Glenn Johnson was a nightmare for it. Javier Mascherano was a little bitch for it. There was a few footballers, quite a few at Liverpool during that period. And I wouldn't even mind, if they did it now, it wouldn't fucking bother me because the Premier League and European Cup winners, I'd love to be ignored by Virgil van Dijk. It'd make my day. But when you're being ignored by players that aren't actually winning anything either, that are also rans, that aren't fit to wear the shirt, as a Liverpool fan, that upset me. And during that period of being in the press box, of being around the media room, around the clubs, certainly because Liverpool was in my heart as a season ticket holder, as a fan, I lost my enjoyment for football. I lost my love for Liverpool Football Club in a way because I knew it mattered more to me and the people in the stands than it did to the people wearing the shirt. Mm-hmm. And it was being ignored by footballers who would be like, oh yeah, you can, or the club, right, we've set up this interview with you with such and such. Great. You can't talk about this, or this, and we want copy approval. Wait a minute. This is not a fucking in-house magazine. This is not the club program. With a newspaper, you can't have copy approval. Well, you're not having the interview then. That shit was a daily occurrence. That happened a lot, and it got quite soul-destroying. And in the end, it was mental because, my dad brought me up on football. All my mates are bigger football fans than they are fight fans. And they couldn't believe it. They were like, what do you mean you don't want to cover football no more? You've just come back from Madrid covering Liverpool in the Champions League quarterfinal. You don't want to give that up. I was like, yeah, but we lost. And the difference is, I know these players. I know the club too well. I'm not enjoying it anymore. So I did. I stopped. I made a conscious decision to stop and to just focus on being a boxing and it would come later, a fight sports journalist, because the fighters, at the time then, Ricky Hatton was on his way to fighting Costa too. And I would ring Ricky and he would answer the phone after 2 rings. You know what I mean? And then you want me to stand outside a training ground and wait for a fucking under-21 player to ignore me for an interview? There's just no chance. And I cut my ties with it. And it's, to be fair, it's obviously we're winning now, which is great. But over the last 6-7 years, where I've gone back to standing on the terraces, back to my season ticket on the Cop, I go with all the lads. We have a few beers. We go at once, every home game, of course, whether it's Champions League or League, and it's back. I love it, Mike. It's my release now. I get there. I like most sports fans. I just have a couple of beers, scream and shout as loud as I like. It's obviously a wonderful time to be a Liverpool fan once again. So I've got my love for it back. But that really did, more than anything, push me towards fight sports, because the fight sports, the fighters themselves, and the people involved in fight sports. And that's fundamentally what it's all about. 22 years I've been covering boxing. Over a decade, well over a decade now, I've been covering MMA. I love them both equally. I love the people involved in both equally. I've got so many friends. All of my professional friends are obviously involved in fight sports, but most of the most genuine people, honest people, lovable, giving people in my life are connected to fight sports. And it's weird that it upsets me that people aren't fight fans who are outside of our bubble, because we do live in a bubble, Mike. We think the whole world's invested in this. We think the world cares that Lomachenko is fighting Teofimo Lopez in a few weeks. We think the world will stop. Like, literally, the earth will stop spinning for that fight. It will for us. But for 99.9% of the population, it won't at all. It won't even resonate on their radar. But I think those people, the people that I've met covering fight sports, sitting ringside, being in gyms, they're just the best people in the world. And I can't explain that enough to people who are outside of our bubble. Come in. Don't be intimidated by fight sports. Don't be worried about a bloody nose or a cage. Like, the sight of a cage still puts people off. I'm like, it's there for safety. Come and get involved. People are in there willingly. People aren't fighting necessarily because they've got no other options in life. When people are fighting at this level, the level that we're commentating on, that we're watching, this is a life decision. This is their choice. This is in their DNA. And this is my big thing about fight sports. And this is the reason why I love it. And I can't explain this enough, that I could be captain of Liverpool. Genuinely. I could walk out at Anfield on Saturday when Liverpool play Leeds in the first game of the Premier League. In my mind, I could do that. In my mind, that, have I got the talent? Of course not. And age is certainly against me now. But I could do that. And I can relate to people that do that on a very personal level. Yeah. When you got to 14, Jordan Henderson, you carried on kicking a ball. I went chasing girls around the schoolyard for kisses. I drifted away. I believe my focus went over there, or whatever it was, education, whatever it may be. You had the single-minded belief that you were going to be a footballer, and you followed that route, and that is what got you to where you are. Congratulations. But that could have been me. Now, this is the difference. I couldn't walk out at Madison Square Garden and fight 12 rounds for a world title. I couldn't do it. I couldn't even walk out and fight 6 rounds at York Hall in front of the live TV cameras. I've done a lot of sparring over the years, and I want to talk about 2008, a box Shane Neary in 2008. We'll come back to that in a minute, in front of an audience, and that was incredible. But what prize fighters have got, and this is why I'm enamored by them, and I adore them, and I'm in awe of them. Prize fighters have got a genetic makeup that 99.9% of the population don't have. Most people fight or flight. Most people walk away. Most people run away from a fight. Most people, when someone throws a punch, do this and wince and cower away. That's just human nature. Protect yourself. Oh my goodness. Close your eyes, hide, curl up in a ball. Prize fighters are born with something different. Prize fighters walk towards it. And that's not to say firefighters or CEOs of these big companies in New York and whatever else, these billion-dollar companies, maybe they could have been prize fighters in a different life. Maybe they've got the same combative DNA, but I don't think it's in my DNA. I genuinely, whenever I would spar, let me talk about sparring first and foremost. I couldn't eat the day I was sparring, and I'm sparring at a amateur boxing gym with novice boxers. I wouldn't eat that day. I would think about it all day. And don't get me wrong, once the spar was finished, it was like when you get off a roller coaster, the adrenaline, you just think, this is what life's all about. I am living my life. Getting punched in the face and punch someone back and having that violent chess play out is the most beautiful thing. But actually getting in there and putting the gloves on, my hands would be trembling. And I consciously then was like, these people are not like me. These people are made differently from me and all other sportsmen. And it fascinated me. I couldn't, and that's still, to this very day, is still the thing that draws me towards fighters. You're different from me. Your makeup is different. Your genealogy is different. Your DNA, I swear to God, their DNA is different from my DNA. And I'm fascinated by that. And I love them for that. And that's why I will always put fighters on a pedestal above all other sportsmen.
Nick, being a Liverpool lad, can you just describe to our non-UK listeners why Liverpool is such a big fight city?
In Liverpool, we can literally do two things: football and fighting. That's all lads do, because it's absolutely a working class city. You know, it's a city that in the 80s was abandoned by the UK government. Margaret Thatcher spit on a grave. She abandoned the city of Liverpool, and the Tory government at the time abandoned the city of Liverpool. And there's actual documentations out there of basically, like, you know, it was almost like they wanted to just fucking put a wall around the city, you know, because they completely ruined it. They took the docks away. You know, Liverpool was, look at your history. Liverpool was one of the most significant ports in world history, in heritage, you know. And listen, right now as well, it's a really important conversation about Black Lives Matter. And of course, you know, I'm totally on board with all that. And I'm totally on board with the fact that the history, colonialism and the history and Britain's part in the slave trade needs to be taught in schools. It should be taught to everybody. We shouldn't be hiding from it. You know, should there be statues of slave traders up and down the country? Of course there shouldn't be. They should have been ripped down years ago. But that doesn't mean we should hide from the history. And fundamentally, Liverpool as a city, the riches that were brought to this city were built on the slave trade. Liverpool was the port that was part of the Americas, the Africas to Europe. You know, we were in that literal loop. And Liverpool and Manchester as well. A lot of the growth there, a lot of the history when you go around the affluent parts of Liverpool, or certainly the most picturesque parts of Liverpool, and certainly of Manchester as well. You know, the big Victorian stately homes, the homes that go back, you know, most of them are turned into luxury flats these days. But in one stage, you know, years ago, there's parts of Liverpool with there's just streets and streets of these incredibly glamorous homes that had servants' quarters and everything else, and there was tons of money there. Well, they were cotton traders, they were tobacco merchants, they were, you know, basically people that were benefiting from the slave trade. You know, that is all fundamentally part of Liverpool's history, and you can't run away from that. That's just the history itself. So Liverpool itself was such a strong port and was such a significant part of the British Empire. And it had a bad time for a few years, but the docks were always, you know, the Titanic was either built in Liverpool or it set sail from Liverpool. It was built in Liverpool, the Titanic set sail from Southampton, I think, but it was built in Liverpool, which is why Liverpool is the name stamped across the back of the Titanic. You know, this is where it was a major port. And then in the 80s, Thatcher closed the docks down, made all the dockers redundant, moved that work down south. And, you know, the city was very much abandoned, and it became very much a tough city then in the 80s, you know. And this was, bear in mind, the 60s, again, Liverpool was the focal point of the world. With the Beatles, the swinging 60s, the Beatles were from Liverpool. You know, it was all here, the cavern. My nan worked in the cavern where the Beatles basically built up their early reputation before they went over to Germany, and then obviously got signed and became an absolute global phenomenon. Everyone's heard of the cavern, you know, and the cavern was where they used to play. My nan used to sit, never sold alcohol in there then. My nan used to work in the bar and they used to serve tea. How British is that? So the Beatles in the very early 60s, late 50s, when they were teenage boys just starting out, played in the cavern to people drinking tea. Absolutely mental. But again, you know, despite all this culture, despite all this history, despite all this money that was in Liverpool for so many years, it was abandoned by the Tories. It became a working class city. It became very much, you know, a stereotype city. We became a laughing stock of the whole of the UK. In the 80s, when London, when the boom and the yuppies and the loads of money and the, you know, all that kind of affluence was down south, there wasn't a job for people in Liverpool. People were leaving Liverpool like rats leaving a sinking ship because it had been abandoned by the government. So that's how you create there a city that's got nothing. That there is no tennis courts. The golf courses get abandoned. There's no money for anyone. So the only thing left is kicking a football around the street and boxing on street corners. And fundamentally, that's where the boxing gyms then came into their own. That's where they became community hubs. You know, and we've got a rich history in boxing as well, of course, dating back to Nell Tarleton and all those kind of guys. You know, guys very much early on knocking on the door for world titles, and Kid Tiger and all these kind of people. Phenomenal history Liverpool's got. But then when we did bounce back, when you know, it was tough in the 90s, but then the noughties, we had the capital of culture in 2008, where Europe plumped, you know, put a ton of money into Liverpool and really rebuilt the docks area and made it a tourist attraction and everything else. The boxing gyms then got support, and then, you know, there was a guy called Paul King who doesn't get the deserve he should. He was a boxing development officer employed by the Liverpool City Council, and he was the only one in the UK. And Liverpool had someone who was working for the council that was a boxing development officer. His job was to get the most money, all the grants for Liverpool amateur boxing gyms, to find funding for Liverpool's best boxers. And there was a period then, you know, the Smith brothers, Bellew, David Price, Derry Matthews, David Burke, Stephen Burke, the Mulhollands. You know, these were guys that were going to Olympic Games, captain and GB at the Olympic Games. And it was basically, Liverpool became the number one focal point for amateur boxing just because of the funding that Paul King was able to generate. And this was at the time, of course, when, you know, we just had Audley Harrison. You know, Audley Harrison deserves all the praise in the world, because without Audley Harrison, there's probably no Anthony Joshua. You know, there's probably no Tyson Fury. There's probably no, because him going to Sydney and winning that super heavyweight gold medal was such a freak thing. But what it did was it provided the lottery funding, which had just come in at the time. UK had just got its first national lottery, and there was lottery money to be spent. And they were going, right, where do we divvy up the money then? And it was no longer just throw it all at athletics. It was like, where do we get medals? Wait a minute, we just got a boxing medal in. It generated so many headlines back home. All the newspapers want to speak to this Audley Harrison guy. Let's put a bit of money into boxing. 4 years later, Amir Khan goes to Athens, wins a silver medal. Okay, let's put a bit more money into boxing. And then it starts building then. And since then, we've had more success in the Olympic Games than any time before, purely because the funding's been there. And Liverpool at the time, as I say, was just such a little hotspot, because we were the dominant force, or Liverpool was the dominant force in amateur boxing, just as the funding started going in. And that's why now, you know, I've just rattled off a few names there, but that's why we've had, you know, Callum Smith, world champion, Liam Smith, world champion, Tony Bellew, world champion, Stephen Smith, Paul Smith, world title contenders, Derry Matthews, world title contender, Rocky Fielding, world champion. That's why there's literally dozens from this generation that have reaped the benefits of that funding and Paul King's role in developing this city's amateur boxing scene.
Because obviously you've covered fight spots, you know, all around the world, and there's definitely a huge difference in the UK than the US and everywhere else. You know, the fans are less tribal, and, you know, fights that, you know, I believe would sell out in 30 minutes in the UK, you know, in the US, you can walk up and get a ticket on the day. Yeah.
It is absolutely crazy. And I think that's still why a lot of US fighters, whenever we interview them and speak to them, and they're all desperate to fight in the UK. They're all desperate to, because they realize as well that UK fight fans, because for years we were starved of American fighters, when there was suddenly that surge of American fighters coming over here, and I think those days have gone a little bit now, certainly because DAZN have put ridiculous amounts of money into the sport, and suddenly we've become less of an attraction now. But I think there was a period there where we were getting all the big fighters coming over here, Terence Crawford, Lomachenko, Errol Spence. You know, everyone was coming over to the UK to fight because the UK was where it was at. And you're right, it is very tribal in terms of, you know, let's say a Liverpool boxer faces a guy from Manchester, then you have that local rivalry. And it's the football rivalry comes into it, the city rivalry comes into it. I don't know whether you get that in the US, because it's, you know, because the US is so big. You know, Manchester is literally, I can be in Manchester city centre in 30 minutes from my house. And yet the rivalry from one stretch of road, the M62, one stretch of motorway, the rivalry from one end to the other is absolutely insane. You know, Scousers and Mancunians are very similar, obviously, because we live so close together. But our accents are so completely different. And when it comes to sport, we are absolutely tribal about it. You know, they've got Manchester City and Manchester United. We've got Liverpool and Everton. You know, 4 Premier League, real big, powerful clubs there with big clouds. with rich histories, or certainly not necessarily Manchester City, but the rich histories there with those clubs, a lot of success on the pitch. Of course, it's always going to build up. And the thing is as well, there's fashion. You go to Manchester, you can tell a lad from Manchester walking down the street in Liverpool, and you can tell a lad from Liverpool walking down the street in Manchester. These are cities 30 minutes apart, and yet everything's different. The music, the look, the feel, the dress, the accents, the clubs, the sport. And listen, the difference then is, though, you go to America with Ricky Hatton. Twice I went over for the Mayweather fight and the Pacquiao fight. I was on a flight with Mancunians, Scousers, Brummies from Birmingham, Londoners, Geordies. It's like the whole of the UK we're so tribal when it's at home, but when one of ours goes abroad, maybe it's an excuse to get on the lash, maybe it's just an excuse to go to Vegas or to New York, but it's like, okay, it's no longer, if Ricky Hatton's fighting a guy from Liverpool, then the Liverpool fans go, right, okay, let's go and see. Hope Ricky Hatton gets beat. Come on, yeah, we're supporting the Liverpool guy. But once Ricky Hatton transcends that and goes onto a global stage, like any fighter from the UK, local tribalism is out the window. Now he's one of us. Now he's a Brit going abroad. Right, we're all going now. So the same guys that a year earlier might have been booing Ricky Hatton to cheer on the Scouser, and now in Vegas singing and dancing, we're walking in a Ricky Wonderland because he's one of us now. It's different. And I think that separation, you don't kind of get that in the US. You don't kind of get that tribal nature. Like the best atmosphere in the US, I went for Mayweather Hatton, and you would think it was 99% Ricky Hatton fans just because of where the noise was at. And don't get me wrong, there was a lot of fans who were there as boxing fans and love, of course, Floyd and what he's done and what his legacy is and what his performance was against Ricky. And, no doubt he got a standing ovation. But you better believe for every second of that fight, while it lasted, we wanted Ricky Hatton to win. The Brits wanted Ricky Hatton to win. Now, when we went for the Manny Pacquiao fight, now that was a different story. That felt like there was more Filipinos than even Brits, because the Filipinos turned out in force then. So that night was incredible. I remember they were giving masks out at the MGN. There was a Ricky mask and there was a Manny mask, and the atmosphere was just unbelievable because for one of the very rare occasions, the Ricky Hatton traveling fan base had competition. And for me, they got outsung that night. I thought the Filipino crowd that night were unbelievable. And obviously, they got that moment as well, which made it even better. But even around it, even the weigh-ins and walking down into the arena for fight night, it felt like it was the Filipinos' night. They were making all the noise. So yeah, it's not just us, but I think that's why Americans look at us enviously, because we are a small nation. Don't get away from it. Obviously, the Commonwealth and the history is part of history now. The UK is very much an island. So when we get to the US, we feel, we kind of clump together. We come together as a little unit, and we're like, right, we're all together. Whereas you go to the US and fucking hell, people from Philadelphia don't talk to people from New York. People from New York don't talk to other people from New York. You know what I mean? People from North Boston don't get on with people from South Boston. It's weird. It's weird.
What was the first fight that you covered in Vegas?
Good question. God, I've got no idea. I'd have to have a look at my lanyards. I'm one of those people, because I started covering fights pretty early. I was still 20, 21. I got into the habit of collecting the lanyards, so I've got like a box full of about 1,000 lanyards somewhere, maybe even more. I don't know, but. One fight I do remember was in America, though. And I like to talk about this in the podcast, and I want to talk about it now before I forget. And this goes back to budding journalists wanting to build a career. Don't look at amateur boxing tournaments or even, regional boxing tournaments or regional professional events like anything but experience and an opportunity to build relationships. Because 2008 European Championships, amateur championships came to Liverpool, and the opening rounds were held at a sports centre 5 minutes walk from my old house. And when I say sports centre, I mean this place didn't even have bleachers. I'm talking about a sports hall, basketball net at either end of the court. They just plonked a ring in the middle and put some garden chairs around it. That's how few fans turned out for the opening round of the 2008 European Championships. But what I knew and what the gaggle of, say, 50 old boxing coaches knew that were there, that had turned up from around the UK to watch it, was that there was a Ukrainian kid in there that had the potential to do amazing things. And obviously that was Vasyl Lomachenko. And the things I seen Vasyl Lomachenko do in that sports hall in 2008, I remember writing a column. I wrote a column for the paper that week and said, I've just seen the greatest amateur boxer potentially of all time. I've just seen someone do something in a boxing ring that I've never, ever seen before on watching film, YouTube, legends. You know, as I say, I was a huge fan, of course, of Tyson from the 80s, and Sugar Ray Leonard was my guy. And, you know, so many great boxers that had followed over the years. But this kid, this little skinny Ukrainian kid, was handling, you know, top level opponents in a European Championships and major tournaments. And England fight, you know, members of the England team who I knew personally, that were ABA champions, national champions that were good. And I was like, oh, I'm interested to see how this kid does against him. And he would win a whole round as a southpaw, then switch and win the next round as orthodox. And then in the next round, he would throw nothing but corkscrew uppercuts for a minute. And then for the next minute, he would like throw nothing but a left hook and a left jab combination. This was Lomachenko in the European Championships. And of course, he pissed it. He pissed the gold medal. He won, you know, boxer of the tournament. Of course he did. And he did it without breaking a sweat. And the stuff he was doing, even then, the footwork, the way he was able to maneuver around the ring as a young man back then, you knew then. I knew then. I wrote a column about it then saying this kid is something very, very special. And, it was a shame he stayed amateur for so long, because I think he'd be on a completely different level now if he turned pro. But listen, he wanted to win two gold medals, and all credit to him. And it's not like he's done anything but incredible things as a pro as well. But I will always look back, and that's one of my favorite lanyards. And it's not even a cool one. It's not even got a hologram on, or it's not even from Vegas with me face on or anything like that. It's just a little thing. European Championships 2008, a little piece of paper in a plastic thingy and on a piece of string. And that, I cherish that as much as anything else, because that was the moment that I truly was in the presence of greatness. And I still see Lomachenko as that now. Lomachenko is playing a different game than everybody else. I truly believe that.
And it's one of those things, it's good for journalists to get their foot in the door, you know, with a young amateur. So when they turn pro, you're already a familiar face. You've already conducted those interviews and they already know you. Exactly.
You know, and I'll be honest, that didn't happen with Lomachenko. Although when I did interview him, I interviewed him a couple of years ago in the UK. I think it was ahead of the Usyk fight with Bellew. And I interviewed him then, and that's how I opened the interview. I was like, oh, great to see you again, Loma. You know, I haven't seen you since 2008. And this was like fucking 2 years ago. It was like, you know, this was like 10 years later. And I'm like, you know, last time I seen you was in Liverpool, Greenbank Sports Centre and blah, blah. And we had a word afterwards. You just beat him and you fought the whole round as a southpaw, Loma. I've got to ask you about this. And obviously he was like, who the fuck is this guy? What is he on about? Because obviously to him, it's just another tournament. It's just another gold medal. It is what it is. It's part of a very rich tapestry in his life. But for me, that was such a fundamental moment that it will always be etched in my brain. And that's the one thing I want to get over to budding journalists. You never know. You never know who your next interview is going to be with. You never know who's going to be at the gym on that day. Like Ricky Hatton, perfect example. I'm flying to America. Ricky Hatton's fighting Floyd Mayweather. I've got a layover in the US. Pretty sure it was Detroit. So I'm sitting. No, it wasn't. Was it Detroit or Philly? Wherever it was. I'm in a layover. A couple of hours till me connecting flight to Vegas. Goes and sits in a sports bar as everybody does. Finds myself a TV. Orders a beer. Orders a Philly cheesesteak or whatever it was. Proper tourist. And I'm sitting there and I'm reading a book. And it was a book called The Five Kings. And it was the story of, you know, Leonard and Hagler and Hearns and all that kind of stuff. And I'm reading away. I'm just engrossed in it, waiting for me flight, you know, blah, blah, blah. Guy sits next to me. I didn't even look at him, but he just tapped me on the shoulder. And before I could even look up, he went, "What a fight that was." And he just pointed to the book, to a reference in the book. And I'm like, probably a Hagler chapter or whatever it may be. And I was like, yeah. And as I turned around like that, it was Emmanuel Stewart. Emmanuel Stewart sat down next to me in a sports bar, in a layover, and he was waiting for the same flight. He was going to Vegas. He was part of the commentary team. He was involved in the Hatton Mayweather fight. And I put the book down. I turned to him and said, "Oh my goodness, Manny Stewart, what an absolute pleasure to meet you." I explained who I was. I'm a journalist. I'm on my way over. It would absolutely make my day if you join me and, grab it. And he was like, "Yeah, of course, man. Of course. Yeah. Well, I thought you'd never ask." Sat down. He gets himself a drink. And we just shoot the shit for 2 hours, just talking fight sports, talking everything. We were dissecting the Hatton fight. And he was telling me as well, he was like, "Listen, I really fancy Ricky's chances. He's got the momentum, the win over Tsu." And it was just those 2 hours where you think, I wish I'd recorded that. I wish just for prosperity's sake, and not necessarily for anything he'd said. It was a really casual conversation. But in hindsight, you're picking the brains of one of the greatest minds in the history of boxing. But in that moment, you don't think like that. But thankfully, as we settled the check, the flight was ready, and we said our goodbyes and whatever else. And just as I was about to pack up, I said, "Manny, could you do us a huge favor? Would you mind signing this book?" And he put a little note in the front of that book, and he signed it. And I've still got it now. It's on my bookshelf. It's one of my most treasured possessions. I like to tell people about it, show them to it, and go, "Don't fucking touch it. Put it back." Manny Stewart touched that. Manny Stewart signed that. So that, again, you never know who you're going to bump into on these crazy journeys when you're driving to these fights, when you're covering these fights. You never know who's going to be in the audience. You never know who you're going to, interact with, and what kind of relationship that might produce in the future. You never know the novice boxer who you're reporting on right now, where he might go. Who could have guessed that? Me saying Tony Bellew probably should have lost his third fight as an amateur because I thought he was just a puncher. I'd written this as well. I was just a puncher, this kid swinging for the fences. He'll get outboxed. Who knew he would go on to become, cruiserweight champion of the world and, fight the former heavyweight champion and everything else. Again, you can't experience these things unless you're in there, unless you're on the road. And I would advise anybody to do it. Make the sacrifices you can. I did it when I was young. I did it before I was married, before I had kids. I spent a good 10 years. Every weekend I was at a fight. Whether it was boxing, MMA, didn't matter whether it was 5 hours away by car, didn't matter whether it was a flight away. Most of them I lost money. Most of the time I was working for a regional newspaper. I'm like, "Listen, I want to go to Vegas to cover this fight." And they're like, "Brilliant, yeah, we'll give you your lineage." And I'm like, okay. So I would pay for flights myself. I would pay for hotel rooms myself. I would sleep on people's floors to cover these fights because that was my dream. That was my passion. I wanted to pursue it. I wanted to make a career doing this. This was what I loved. And you've got to make those sacrifices. And even now, the stuff I do now, I still do bits of radio stuff for free. People text me and go, "Can you jump on for 10 minutes now to talk about or react to this, react to that?" There's still stuff I do now for free. Obviously, thankfully, there's stuff that I get paid for now as well. But I don't think that ever goes away. Don't be afraid of doing stuff for free, certainly early on. Put the time in, put the work in, make your voice heard, and make friends and make relationships with as many people in the industry as you possibly can, because it'll always stand you in good stead as you start climbing that ladder. And at the end of the day, be humble and never get away from the fact that, fuck me, your job's watching fights, covering fights, flying around the world, speaking to fighters who are brilliant, who are fascinating, who've got amazing stories, and you're telling those stories. Man, I still pinch myself. I've got mates now that earn an awful lot more money than me, whether they're building surveyors or accountants or business owners, and they're driving around in Bentleys and whatever else, and they're, enjoying the fruits of their labor. Yet when we go out, we have a beer. All they want to talk about was my week. All they want to talk about was what I've been up to. What was Vegas like? What was this like? What have you been doing? Who'd you speak to today? And I'm like, how's business? And like, oh, fucking awful. I hate it. It is what it is. I'm like, I guess in life, I haven't got the money. I drive a Ford Fiesta. Doesn't bother me. I get the train most places. I'm quite happy. I fly economy everywhere. Most of my flights to Vegas involve at least one, sometimes 2 stops. But I ain't going to bitch about it. I ain't going to complain about it. I fucking love it. It's great.
Like an apprenticeship.
Yeah, man. Exactly. And again, there's some times now where I feel like I'm still learning apprenticeship, and that's the beauty of it. You are always learning. And that's another thing which I've found over the years as well. I've got opinions, and I've got strong opinions, and they're based on 20 years of being involved in fight sports. I feel like I can read a fight. I feel like I'm a very good judge of a fight, both boxing and MMA. Some people may disagree, but that's fine. And I'm cool with that. I want people to disagree. Like, one thing I'm getting at the moment a lot, because a lot of the stuff I do on BT for around the UFC stuff, and a lot of stuff that I do around the Fight Disciples, is being a hype guy and getting excited about it, because we all have our specific roles. Sitting on the BT show, for instance, the open match show, Dan is the ex-fighter, the knowledge, the technical. There's not a thing Dan Hardy doesn't know about MMA. The guy is, for me, the best analysis in the sport. He's unbelievable. Adam is no word of a lie. And, I've been doing bits of TV since 2012, 2013. I've done bits of radio for an awful long time. I've had many new radio shows with many different presenters. I've worked with many different presenters, people who've gone on to high things. But I'm telling you right now, and I'm not blowing smoke because he's my business partner, Adam is the best presenter out there. He's the best I've ever worked with, and he's the fucking best out there, because he creates an environment where a lot of people get stressed, a lot of people have to rehearse and do. With Adam, it's just perfectly natural. And because he's so natural and because he's so good, that keeps me at ease. And I'm just completely chilled out. I'm a pretty laid back guy anyway. So I can just be in the moment. And we've got such a good combination. We're like the Ant and Dec of British fight sports, because we are like good mates, but we're really close. We've only known each other 4 years, which surprised a lot of people. But we are really close. We're very similar. We're both Northern lads. We're both very happily married with 2 children, an older boy and a younger girl. Like, our lives are so very similar. Yet we've both got this incredible passion for fight sports, and we both often see things very differently as well. And that just helps. It helps the debate. It helps the chatter. And I love having those conversations. I love putting my view across. I love being the guy, the hype guy on the show, that I feel like I'm a voice for the fans that are pumped like I'm pumped. This is what I think the fans want. This is how I feel, because I'm a fan. I'm viewing this as a fan. And sometimes I do kind of put the 20 years of experience to one side for a minute, because what you've got to realize is when we make these TV shows for BT Sport, we are trying to get people to watch that weekend's UFC. Let's not get away from that. We're there to generate interest in the event. We're there to hype up what's coming on Saturday night, to make people go, shit, I want to watch that. If you crunch too many facts and figures and numbers and statistics, and you want to wax lyrical about, I was there when Chris Weidman knocked out Anderson Silva, and when I went backstage, we had this conversation, and he told me this, and blah, blah. Hardcore fans, you're appealing to hardcore fans there. Hardcore fans want to hear that. Hardcore fans want to hear your backstory, your personal relationship with that fighter from 8 years ago. That's amazing little snippets. I'm hardcore, I want to know that. But those TV shows aren't made for hardcore fans, because hardcore fans, guess what? They're tuning in anyway. Because the hardcore fans, they ain't going to miss a single fight. Those shows are made for football fans, for casual fans, for people that dip in and out of fight sports, people that like the UFC, but only if Connor's fighting, or only if John Jones is fighting. Otherwise, I'm not really bothered. They're the people we're speaking to. They're the voice of them when I'm going, don't miss it. Let me just tell you, this girl is this girl is this guy is this. It's going to be fucking awesome. Someone's getting knocked out. It's a fight not to be missed. Shit, I cannot wait to get there. And the biggest criticism I get from that, and listen, criticism, it's water off a duck's back. I couldn't care less. I read the comments and I buzz off it. And people get comments on Twitter and come at me on Twitter for saying things and whatever else. And I just kill them with kindness. I just go back and go, yeah, man, that's cool. But it's my opinion. If your opinion differs, man, tell me why it differs. Let's have a little debate about why you think your way and I think my way. And you know what? If you're right, I'll go, cool, man. And you know what? You've won me over. I think you're right. I didn't think of it like that. Or maybe I can win you over. Let's have a chat about it. But one thing that gets thrown at me a lot is, he's a bad casual. Have you seen this term used, Mike, on social media? A casual. This guy's a casual, man. What the? Like, it's a derogatory term. Like, Calling someone a casual that is watching fight sports is not a derogatory term, because guess what, guys? The hardcore fans, we're here. We will be here if there was no TV and they were streaming top-ranked shows on a shitty website somewhere and we couldn't get it on TV, or Eddie Hearn lost the deal with Sky because no one's watching Sky Sports, so Eddie's having to stream via IFL on YouTube. We're here. The hardcore fans, we're still going to be here. We're still going to be watching fights because we're in it. The casual fan is the most important fan, because the casual fan is everybody else outside of our bubble. Our bubble is this small. We are in a goldfish bowl. The casual fan lives outside the goldfish bowl. We've got to appeal to the casual fan because we want more people to watch fight sports, because the more people that watch fight sports, the more TV companies are going to be involved, the more wages for the fighters, the more athletes that are going to be attracted to become fighters in the first place. You know, it's absolutely rolling forward like that. You know, you've got to attract people to the sport. The casual fan is the most important fan. So when people say to me, oh, for fuck's sake, this guy again, man, he's a super casual. Yeah, man, I'm not appealing to you. I'm appealing to all the casuals. I'm trying to get them hyped. I'm trying to get them involved in the sport. If you want to know about the 20 years I've done in the sport, covering boxing, covering UFC, go and buy a magazine or read a newspaper or read one of my articles that are online, where it's probably a little bit more in-depth. It's a little bit more hardcore if that's what you want. Don't watch a TV show or even a podcast, because Fight Disciples, we've made that for casual fans. We've made that for football fans. We want them to come to boxing. So we're appealing to them as well, because guess what? There's more of them than there is of us, hardcore fans. So, yeah, man, I am a turbo casual. I'm proud to admit it. It's cool. I'm happy because that's the audience I'm after.
Do you think the UFC do a better job of getting those casual fans in with their overall package? Because I think you've said on the Fight Disciples, you know, when you go to a UFC event, it's completely different to a boxing event.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, I think fundamentally as well, I think, you know, this summer's been huge for the UFC. Not having to stop, not missing a beat, being able to put on events every week, and not even just events, but world title fights and good title fights. That comes back to the way the UFC is built and the way they keep the majority of the money. That's allowed them to put that infrastructure in place. So, of course, that is part of it. Sorry, Mike, what was the question again? Your first question.
Just the UFC, do you think they do a better overall package for those casual fans?
100%. Sorry, yeah, 100%. Because what we're finding is we live in a viral world right now, and the viral world demands quick content, viral moments, 10-second clips, 1-minute clips. And the UFC is great at generating that because there's so much action. Every 30 minutes, you know, the UFC events, you know exactly how it works. Regardless of how many fights are on, regardless of what time the event starts, you know, as soon as that first fight makes the ring walk, every 30 minutes there will be another fight. Doesn't matter whether it ends in 1 minute, doesn't matter if it goes the full 3 rounds. 30 minutes, you can set your watch by it. The next guy will make his ring walk in 30 minutes. The next person will ring walk in 30 minutes. Every fight is 30 minutes apart, and that's because of the structure of the 3 rounds that they've got in place. But what that allows them to do is bottleneck and package a product that is so perfectly placed. You know, in that 30 minutes, 5 minutes for the ring walks, 15 minutes potentially for the fight, or 18 minutes if you allow the extra minute. And then the last 5 minutes is previewing the next guys that are going to walk on the jumbo screens. Here's a quick interview with him. Here's a quick interview with him. Little reminder of the narrative that's going on between them, or the camps that they're from, or whatever it may be. Maybe a little shake-up of the middleweight division. By the way, here's a quick promo for your main event that's coming later. Boom, we're ring walking. And you can set your watch by it. So as soon as you sit down, as soon as that first bell goes, that first fight starts at a UFC event, you will find that 70% of the arena is filled, because people are there knowing that the entertainment has begun. And the first fight in the UFC, because of that structure, has got the ability to be as entertaining as the main event, because the first fight is as competitive potentially as the main event. You know, there is no journeyman in the UFC. There is no pushovers. Yes, there's a few legends in there now that you can maybe consider a soft touch. Yes, there's a few favorable matchups that can still be made. But everybody in the UFC is the best of the best mixed martial artists that are on this planet, certainly in the men's weight classes at least. So you know the standard that you're going to get. Whereas let's face it, 20 years of covering boxing, all the pro shows, I would be first there. I would go to a pro show at a sports centre 15 years ago and would be first there as they were still putting the chairs out, because I was basically, I was finding my way in the sport. I was making relationships and I wanted to cover every fight religiously. Now, if I'm covering a fight, I probably won't even be in my ringside seat until the last 4 or 5 fights. I won't even bother with the first 4, because I'll tell you how just looking at a card, I'll tell you how the first 4 fights are going to go. And you know what? Chances are I'll probably pick how the first 2 fights of the last 4 are going to go as well. So on an 8-fight card, any 8-fight card in pro boxing, I can almost guarantee I can pick, and you could pick, the winner of the first 6 fights. And that is fundamentally where boxing is flawed. And what we get told is, but it's always been that way. That's the way boxing works. That's the way it is. It's guys building up their reputation, building up their ledger, building up their record and everything else. Now, UFC doesn't suffer like that because people build their record outside of the UFC. It's a fallacy to think there isn't journeyman in MMA. There is journeyman in the sport of mixed martial arts. I know many guys that have had 10, 20, 30 fights and never won one. There is people like that in mixed martial arts. You will just never see them people anywhere near the UFC. And I think it's unfavorable when we often compare it and go, Top Rank have got a card on Saturday night, and let's face it, the main and co-main event are competitive. The other 6 fights, fucking hell, come on, Top Rank. You've got Olympians in there against fucking club level fighters who haven't had a win in 5 years. And we address it that way, but the sports are set up differently. Top Rank have got to give a platform to their new talent, and they've got to build them and slowly introduce them to the boxing audience, both in the arenas and on TV, by putting them on undercards and slowly building them up. That's just the way boxing is set up. Will we see it ever change? Well, for me, this was the perfect time to do it. But we're still seeing guys in mismatches, in lockdown shows in the bubble at the MGM, in Frank Warren shows at BT Sport, and in Eddie Hearn's back garden. Yes, don't get me wrong. I think Eddie's probably performed better than most. So many competitive fights there and so many big amazing moments. But there was still plenty of middleweights fighting welterweights. And by the way, oh yeah, he's a good lad, him. Yeah, he fought at British level once. Yeah, he did, Eddie. Fucking 2 weights below. Don't try and pull the wool over our eyes. It is what it is. The other argument, of course, is, and this is something close to my heart, because if you don't know, my parents, my mum runs the biggest fight and medical clinic in England. So she runs a clinic called Fit to Fight, and they basically do annual medical screenings for about 50% of the UK's boxing and a ton of MMA fighters as well, which is something I helped set up many, many years ago. She's been doing it for over 10 years now. She loves it, absolutely loves it. My mum's got, I'll go to my mum's for Sunday lunch and she'd be like, oh, I had a lovely chat with Tyson this week. Tyson Fury was in. Oh, he's a lovely lad. And, and you just think, what is going on in the world? This is mental. But, yeah, she has this amazing relationship with the fighters at a completely different level. And for obvious reasons, I don't get involved in her business because me being a journalist, her being a medical business and everything else, I just don't get involved. But some of the stuff she talks about, there's journeymen that will go and see me mum once a year. And this happens the world over, of course. Journeyman boxers that the worst day of the year is the day they go to get their medical. And sometimes as fight journalists and fight fans, we don't think about this. The journeyman is such a crucial part of boxing, not only because they build the records and they build the experience of potential fighters that move on to the next level and go all the way, but also there's this real strong, it's not just a fringe, but it's a real strong, demographic of professional fighters are there for the paycheck, are there to supplement their income as they may have another job. And critically, one day a year, they go to get their medical. If they fail that brain scan, they can't box. They lose their livelihood. And I think this is something we often overlook. And I'd love to do, and I probably will do at some stage, a podcast series maybe called The Journeyman, because their stories is as fascinating as any prospect. They've probably got it even worse, because imagine boxing every week, but knowing wherever fight you turn up at, you're being paid to lose. But what you are being paid to do is put in a good fight and give the kids some experience, the guy you're facing on the other side of the ring. It's a weird thing that we don't kind of address. And again, it doesn't exist in the UFC, because have you noticed it's not MMA that gets compared with professional boxing? It's UFC that gets compared with professional boxing. And that's not fair. It's not a fair comparison. Because as I say, if you're going to do that, then you should only really compare the UFC against the top 2 or 3 fights from every pro card around the world. That's the only real fair way to do it, in my opinion.
Obviously, both businesses really well, the MMA world and the boxing world. If you were a talented young fighter and you were talented enough to pick between the MMA or the boxing route, what would you pick?
MMA.
You would?
Yeah, MMA. Even though there's less money in it. And a perfect example. So, going back to, what date will it have been now? Probably looking at 2008, 2009, maybe sometime around then, 2010. There was a boxer in the UK called Danny Roberts. Now, Danny was from Bristol, but he'd moved to Liverpool, and he was, he had the work ethic. He had everything going for him in terms of what you want as a trainer in a fighter. He would walk through walls for you, and he had ability. And he was signed to a manager. I won't say who the manager was, here in the UK. And he had a contract that was a real binding contract, like a crazy 7-fight deal contract. And the manager was always spring and late fights on him, fights out of his weight division. So he'd be given away a stone or two. He'd be given just a week's notice. He'd be, basically he wasn't a looked after fighter, but he had the mentality of a fighter that wanted to become a world champion. He wanted to go all the way. He was willing to sacrifice, and he had he certainly had the natural athletic ability. And weirdly, we used to just walk our dog together. We lived close by, and we used to always bump into each other walking our dogs. And obviously, we'd always talk fight sports. And he was talking about boxing, and could I help him get out of this management contract, and what advice did I have for him, and everything else. And this is 2010. So UFC was still very much in this growth period. We had a couple of fighters from the UK that were in the UFC that were doing things. And we had a couple of gyms in Liverpool that were really strong. And we were chatting one day, and he said, there's a BJJ gym opened up next door to where we do the boxing, where we train. And, I might go in there and do a little bit of body strength. And I was like, yeah, it's a good idea, man. Yeah, absolutely. I know the coach. He's a fantastic BJJ coach. You should definitely dive in there. And then over the course of a couple of weeks, he was like, I'm fucking love it. I'm enjoying going to the BJJ and the grappling class more than I am my boxing class now, because he would become so disillusioned with boxing because he'd been stitched up that he didn't know which way to turn with it. And, he was frustrated he was stuck in this contract, and, he felt like he was getting dealt a bad hand every time. So he was loving the MMA training, and then one thing led to another. And then he said, literally one day, he was like, listen, I'm speaking to a number of people around me that I trust, that I like, and whatever else. And I'd like to ask you the same question. The BJJ coach thinks I should move into MMA and make that transition over. What do you think? And I just said, categorically, 100% yes. 100% yes. Because he was a very good boxer. And critically at that time, he was a boxer making that transition to MMA, that we were still in that world where MMA was filled with wrestlers and jiu-jitsu guys, and people with high-level boxing were still chasing the high-level boxing dream, because UFC was still something that went on in America, really. It was something that BJJ guys go into. It wasn't really for me. Still in the UK, it still had the stigma as cage fighting rather than mixed martial arts. It wasn't the sport it is now. But I knew, and certainly other people around Danny, and I'm sure it wasn't just me, but hopefully I helped persuade him. I knew Danny had one thing that a lot of these fighters going into that sport didn't have. He didn't get punched in the face and shit himself like wrestlers do. You punch a wrestler in the face, he panics because he doesn't know used to being punched in the face. He's used to grinding. He's used to grinding on the mats hours after hours after hours. Whereas Danny had that fighting ability, that non-flight, that fight. And I knew he would take to it like a duck to water, and knew his work ethic would work. And then next thing you know, boom, 6 months later, he has his first MMA fight. Then it was MMA fight. He goes into a tournament, does really well in the tournament, Then he fights against the guy called Judo Jimmy from the UK, who's very much a gatekeeper, one of Dan Hardy's good mates, Jimmy Warled, and beats Jimmy Warled. And I knew then the phone call was coming. And now Danny splits his time between Liverpool and Florida. In the UFC, he's very much a staple in the UFC. He's one of the most popular fighters in the whole of the UK. He wins one, he loses one, but he's never in a dull fight. He gets pay-per-view bonuses. He gets bonuses all the time because he's such an entertaining fighter. So yeah, I was actually in that position 10 years ago. Someone asked me, what should I do in this position? And I 100% pushed them that way. The only difference I would give, if you are an Olympic level boxer, if you've boxed at the World Championships, European Championships, if you've got that amateur experience and you're able to catch the attention of someone like a Eddie Hearn or a Frank Warren or, a Luda Bella or, anyone of that nature, then of course stick with boxing. But for everybody else, I think the move to MMA right now makes so much sense to me, because once you get to a certain level, once you get into the UFC, you're treated like a VIP. The wages might not match up against guys who are fighting for, the world titles in boxing. But guess what? That's the 1% of pro boxers. The guys at British title level and maybe even European title level, they're not getting paid the same as what the guys in the UFC are. The guys in the UFC are getting paid more than them. Ain't no one at British title level getting a 50 grand bonus for a great knockout. That shit goes down in the UFC regular. So right here, right now, yeah, I've got to be honest, I would push anybody towards mixed martial arts.
The Fight Disciples.
Yeah,
it's time to set the record straight.
Yes. So Adam, I know I listened to the show last week, and Adam said that we met because I went on to one of his radio shows, and we clicked, and then we decided to set up Fight Disciples. But what really happened was Adam moonlights as a children's magician, and it was the baby's birthday party. So Adam came round, he did a few magic tricks for the kids. You'll love this. So if you want to hire him, just hit Adam Cattle up on social media. He's available for children's parties. He does magic tricks, balloon animals, you name it. The kid's got all the skills. So yeah, that's how we really met. But yeah, later on I went on to a radio show. We did click. We went for a few beers. We sat down and we said, we're both Joe Rogan fans, so let's start a podcast where we can both say exactly what we want to say on our own platform, build our own platform, and get people to, love fight sports as much as we love fight sports. And all we need now is a great name. And I came up with the greatest name. I still think Fight Disciples is a perfect name, sums up exactly what we're about. We're cross code. We love all fighting. And, we are absolutely devotees. We worship at our church is the ring and the cage. That's just the way it is. If I'm not watching fighting, I'm with the kids, or I'm watching Liverpool. Otherwise, I am watching fight sports. That's pretty much all I do. I'm pretty boring.
And how did the BT Sports come about? Did they reach out to you and Adam?
Yeah, well, I'd actually done some work with BT Sport before when I was at Fighters Only, because that was such a prestigious magazine globally. And I spent most of my time here in the UK when BT Sport got involved covering with the UFC as a platform, and they reached out to a couple of renowned MMA journalists, if you like, to kind of come on different magazine shows and whatever else. They'd started a show. Oh, what was it called now? We filmed it in a fucking broom cupboard. And it was it was Dan Hardy and OJ Borge, who works for BBC Radio 2 now. And what they planned to do was have two guests every week. And they would have a journalist, a member of the MMA media, and they would have like an actor or a soap star or a musician, someone else who was into MMA. And it was basically like a magazine show. And I think I was the second MMA journalist. I was basically in episode 2. So I was the second MMA journalist they asked to do it. And I never left. I stayed. They kept me on for every show since. So I had a working relationship with BT for quite some time, and I've been dipping in and out of various shows for them and everything else. And then when I left Fighters Only and set up Fight Disciples with Adam, that was a great way for me then to introduce them to this new platform that I was working on, and that was a great way to introduce them to Adam. And then we pitched to them and we spoke to them many times, about me, Adam and Dan doing a show. We put a pilot together, and then they originally said, yeah, we'll do it. but we're not using Nick. We're going to use a coach, or we're going to use a fighter. So honestly, so the first episode of Open Mat, those two, Dan and Adam, and I'll never forget them for it. They fucked me off, and they went, right, you've been jibbed. The BT are taking us on, and you're not part of the clique anymore. And I was like, you bastards. And they did episode 1, and who did they use? They used John Kavanagh. So it was the similar show as what it is now, but they had John Kavanagh on, and they did episode 2. They used somebody else in episode 2, but midway through that episode, they brought me in as a little bit of like a voice, and trying, I think Dan, to be fair, I think Dan and Adam have both spoke to BT and said, we need to lift the energy levels up, and we know someone that brings the energy, someone that brings the energy. So they kind of reluctantly brought me into episode 2 and put me on at the second part of like episode 2. And I think then, the producers working at BT and everything else, I think then they realized that me, Dan, and Adam have a real, not just me and Adam have got a connection, but Dan as well. The three of us just work so well together. We're so comfortable around each other. We kind of know what each other are going to say next, if you know what I mean. We kind of know we can throw to each other at any point and know we're not going to kind of ruin the conversation. And those conversations that we have on camera, like none of that is scripted. None of that is rehearsed. None of that is even talked about beforehand. That is literally, and BT might go mad for this, but that is literally just turn the cameras on and let these three guys do it. Because Adam gets us in and gets us out. That's his job. I will get you in and get you out. And me and Dan just banter with him. And it just clicks, man. And I think, I'll be honest, I think BT have got something a little bit special because, and it's easy for me to say that because I'm part of it, but I just think that the three of us have got such a good connection, and that's why it works so well. And hopefully long may it continue.
Obviously, you've kind of described how you met Adam. The relationship with Dan Hardy, does that come from obviously just from fighters only, or? Yeah,
but obviously covering Dan's fights. Dan, obviously being from the UK, being in the UFC, very much it was Dan and Michael Bisping were really the front two guys leading this MMA revolution. And a guy from my neck of the woods, Terry Etam, whose fights I covered all over the world, flew all over the world covering his fights in the UFC as well. So I'd known Dan from the beat, if you like. And then when I took over the Fighters Only, Dan was a columnist there. So and Dan is one of these very few professional athletes, newspaper or even online columnist that actually writes his own column. Just to break the fourth wall. Most athletes' columns that you read, or in magazines, or even online, or in newspapers, or sports stars, your favorite sports star or whatever, your club captain, his magazine is column that you can't miss. Chances are he doesn't write that shit. Someone rings him and he's probably on the golf course, because I did it for years. I used to ring ex-footballers for years, and they'd be on the golf course. Like I used to do Jamie Carragher's column for the Liverpool Echo back before he worked in TV. And you'd ring Jamie and you'd be like, right, Jay, I just need, to talk to you about the game this weekend. Liverpool are playing Leeds or whatever it may be. What do you want to talk about? And he'd be like, this was back then. Now he's obviously very opinionated. He's paid for his opinion. But back then, Carragher would just be like, yeah, talk about the front three, and they're a big risk, aren't they? So you want to talk about that? And I'd be like, I've got to turn out 700 words here, Jay. Yeah. Well, listen, I'm on the golf course now. I'm just putting out. Just talk about those front three, and obviously, the left back. I think he's an opportunity as well. All right. Yeah. Sound. Yeah, you know what to write. See you later. Boom. Phone down. that was bog standard, and that goes on a lot. Certainly with these so-called, these ghost-written sports columns. But Dan Hardy, give him his due. You are messing. Dan would ring me and go, why have you edited that? Why have you changed me intro? Why have you turned that around? Not criticizing me, but because he wanted to better himself. He wanted to better himself as being an analyst and a journalist. And sometimes, he would put an argument forward and go, I don't think you should have done that, because this was the point I was trying to make. And sometimes we'd have a great conversation, debate about it. But yeah, even back then, Dan was like, his brain was working like a journalist. His brain was working like an analyst, and that's just the way he's always been like that. He's just the kind of guy he is, that's just the way Dan's mind works. So yeah, I was lucky enough to be Dan's editor, if you like, for a number of years while he was a columnist at Fighters Only as well. And we kind of solidified our relationship now. And of course, now we work together on BT. And also we're both on the board of the UK, the English Mixed Martial Arts Association. So for anyone that doesn't know, here in the UK, in England, we have a fledgling. We are basically trying to. Mixed martial arts is a weird sport because unlike every other sport, which starts at amateur level and then grows from there, mixed martial arts really exploded at UFC pay-per-view level. And now the amateur part of the sport, the fundamental part, the governing bodies and the associations that are responsible for making sure that every MMA gym provides a female dressing room, every MMA gym has got coaches that have all been police checked to make sure they're okay to work with kids. In this area, every MMA gym has been public precautions in case to combat against COVID, all that kind of stuff. We don't have that. That isn't in place. MMA is still pretty much like the Wild West in England, like it is in many places around the world. There's a company based out of Sweden called the IMAF, the International Mixed Martial Arts Federation, and we are a subsidiary of them. So under Mark Goddard, who's the president, who's the UFC referee, he brought together a gaggle of people, myself and Dan included. You know, I'd like to think everybody else, at least on the board, are the top people in mixed martial arts in England. And they've got me to write press releases, I think. That's why I'm part of it. But we are trying to put those practices in place to make sure that every MMA event that's held in England adheres to certain rules and regulations, that the matchmaking is up to standard. Because right now it's Wild West. Anyone can put an MMA show on. Anyone can slap a cage up in a local pub and put fights on and sell tickets, and there's no governing body, there's no regulations in place, there's nothing, and it's terrifying. When you think about the scale of that, it's terrifying. And that goes on all over the world, never mind just England. So we are, as an association, trying to get the government to acknowledge us, and we are trying to make sure that all those safety precautions are in place. So that's another reason why me and Dan are particularly close, that we're kind of fighting a fight together at regional and very much grassroots level for the sport of MMA as well.
For anybody that listens to the Fight Disciples each week, like myself, obviously they'll know that your nickname is The Talent. And looking at your Instagram, you've swam the Mersey, played professional rugby, and you're also the world's tallest jockey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what a year that was. So what happened was, as I was talking about earlier, Liverpool was the European capital of culture in 2008, which meant they were getting a shitload of money from Europe to regenerate the whole city. And, it's been such an important part of the regeneration of Liverpool and putting Liverpool back where it is now. But the editor of the newspaper at the time I was working for sat all the staff down in a big meeting and said, listen, this was in 2007, we need great ideas from people on how we can really maximize this European capital of culture this year, this 2008, and celebrate it in the best way possible. And I thought, fuck yes, this is my opportunity. So I went into his office and I said, listen, give me a year off. I won't come to work anymore for a year. I will train full time and I will compete in 8 different sports at a professional level. And I will compete on Merseyside. So it will tie into the newspaper. It will tie into the European capital of culture for the city. And I will be just a normal guy, a journalist, living out his dreams and doing that one thing that everybody that sits in terraces, whether we're watching tennis or swimming or athletics or football or boxing, we all have that same dream, like, oh, I'd love to do this. Oh, I wish I could do that. I wish I could do that. I wish I could play this out. What I would give to lead Liverpool out on the pitch or whatever it may be. And that was my pitch. I went, give me a year off. I'll compete in 8 different sports. I'll go teetotal for the year. I'll train as a professional. I'll get a nutritionist. I'll get science behind it. I'll do all the work. And I'll write a column every week about what I'm up to that week, where my training's at, how I'm feeling. Anyway, they went for it. And that led to the greatest year of my life in 2008, where I was like training full time as a professional athlete. From literally January to December, I trained full time as a professional athlete. Swear, family weddings, family parties, lads going out at the weekend. I did nothing because I thought this is the one chance I've got to do it. I'll never get this chance again. And to be totally honest, and write a column with real substance, I need to talk about what goes on and the sacrifices that professional athletes need to make, as much as how tough the actual competition is when you actually get out there. So I started the year by running a marathon. which got me in shape for the rest of the year and was probably the least enjoyable of the lot because I'm not a runner at all. It was horrific. And then I went straight into it. I played tennis against Pat Cash at an international tennis tournament in Liverpool. I rode a racehorse around the Aintree Grand National Festival over, on the proper course. It wasn't over the jumps, but it was on the proper course. That was amazing. I spent like 9 weeks getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, driving to the stables, riding different horses all morning. I was living on cups of tea, a piece of Kit Kat, like one little piece of chocolate biscuit. And then overnight, I would have a single boiled chicken breast and 2 tablespoons of rice because I had to get my weight down as low as possible to actually ride a half-decent horse when the challenge came about. And then when the challenge did come about, I got down to 168 pounds. Now I'm 6'2", and I walk around now at 205. And I got down to 168 pounds, 12 stone. That was as low as I was going to go. They had to put me on a jump horse, even though it was a flat race, because obviously I was just so big. And I was in the weigh-in room on the day. It was an actual meeting, so there was jockeys everywhere. There was punters laying bets, and we did this race in between actual races. And there was 4 or 5 jockeys on other horses. They all come round with me. And it was, racing around a racetrack at 40 miles an hour in front of a grandstand full of people was absolutely insane. And something that you think, wow, as if anyone gets to experience how mental that was. And that and the boxing stay with me the most. The tennis was amazing. I played basketball for Everton Tigers as well, which we were in the BBL, the top league of basketball in the UK. I played rugby for Widnes Vikings against Featherstone. That was in a pre-season friendly. They were top level of the rugby league over in the UK as well. What else did I do? It was the most insane year. And they were all physical as well. I didn't do any cop-outs. I didn't do darts or any bullshit like that. They were all... Swimming, yeah, swam across the River Mersey. That was with, again, another guy who I used to write about when I was a kid, when I was on the weekly newspapers. Steve Parry was a lad from my neck of the woods, grew up in my neighborhood. He'd gone over to Tallahassee, Florida on a swimming scholarship, swam for Tallahassee, won Commonwealth Games gold medal. He was a butterfly swimmer, and we were good mates. Like we were so close. We still are now, actually. My kids go to his swimming. He owns a big chain of swimming schools across the UK. My kids go there now. And I spoke to Steve, and we swam across the River Mersey. And the River Mersey is not the widest river in the world, but it's the second most dangerous river in the UK because it's so tidal. You have to. It's kind of like escaping from Alcatraz. You've got a certain amount of time before you can get to the other side. Otherwise, that tide's sweeping you out into the Irish Sea. So it is a really dangerous river to swim, the Mersey. And obviously, Steve's diary was really restrictive as well. So it wasn't like we could wait for a nice day. We just had to do it the day he was available. But again, for that, I trained open water swimming for 3 months in the run up to it. I took it all absolutely seriously. Even the golf. Sorry, I did have one, if you like, easy one physically. I played golf at the Open course the week before the Royal Open was played there. And I went round with Paul Waring, who's still a pro now. He's still on the PGA Tour. And again, I played golf 3 times a week. I went to a golf pro. I had lessons. I did that for months and months and months. I literally lived out every boy's dream, and I did it properly. And I look back now, and it's only the greatest memories. But again, just to bring it back to boxing. So the boxing one was the $1 million question, because everybody knew me. Everyone knew I was the boxing editor. Everybody in boxing wanted to know if I was going to do a boxing one, if I was going to, step up, if you like. And the number of gyms that offered, everybody wanted me to train at their gym. Everybody, all the pros, you better believe, they all wanted to spar me. Like, there was fucking, they were queuing around the block to spar me. And I ended up training at Salisbury ABC, which is one of the most decorated amateur gyms in the UK. And I was sparring with, a lot of the novices there, a lot of the novice pros. At the time, Derry Matthews was training there. David Price was training there. David Burke, the former Olympian, Paul Edwards. There was a real Sam Maxwell was there at the time as well. And I was training there now, and I was literally training with them, with effectively their elite amateur team. And obviously they were leaving me on runs and they were leaving me in everything, but I was, I was putting in the work. And I was so fortunate because of these relationships that I'd built and because of the fact that I'd followed his career as a journalist and had so much aspiration and admiration for him. Shane Erie was the WBU world champion. I covered his career. I was down in London the night he fought Mickey Ward. I think most people remember the movie The Fighter. At the end, Mickey Ward fights Shane Erie in London and becomes a world champion. That is the final moments, of that movie. I was ringside for that fight. I was ringside for it, covering it for the Liverpool Echo. I was there covering Shane Erie. Now, so I'd always had this great relationship with Shay's team, but he was a real standoff fighter, and he was what you see is what you get with him. Super aggressive. And his son JJ Metcalf, who's Commonwealth champion now, who's playing his own trade, who I actually sparred. In fact, I was sparring JJ. He was a teenager when I was training to fight his dad. Say fight, we did a 3-round exhibition. We sold tickets. It was billed as Shane Erie's comeback fight. 1,600 people bought tickets for an event, for a show, a venue in Liverpool, which is used by pro shows a lot, the Liverpool Olympia. We did a full undercard, like a white collar undercard. And it was the most incredible experience. And again, it brought back all those fears that I had as a kid about sparring, about I'm not made to do this, and I got over those fears. Had it been a real fight, who knows how I would have handled it. To me, it was a real fight. To me, it was, people were literally standing at ringside. This was Shane Erie. A couple of years before, he was champion of the world. He was on ITV ITV primetime TV channel, free-to-air TV, every other Saturday, it felt like, through a certain period in the 90s. He was a superstar. He was Ricky Hatton before Ricky Hatton, if you like, on a smaller scale, but he had that kind of a ferocious following. So when people say, oh, Shay's making a comeback. Oh, yeah, he's making a comeback. I'm going. So I made the ring walk, obviously. I ring walk first. I'm standing in the ring waiting for him.
What music?
You know what? And I regret this to this day. I regret it to this day because all the way up, I was just like, I've got to use Rocky. I've got to have Rocky. You
never walk alone.
And what happened was, the week of the fight, I decided it was a good idea to watch the Rocky movies, and then found myself out running at 4:00 in the morning. Because, listen, it was set up as an exhibition, but Shay and his team refused to do any head-to-heads. They refused to do a public weigh-in. They refused to do a lot of stuff. And I was like, well, wait a minute, it's all part of the... And they went, no, not doing any of that. And the only information I got out of their gym where he was training was, he's probably going to use this as a springboard way to get back going again. He was only a couple of years retired. And people were telling me he was laying people out in the gym. Shay's just fucking sparked his third sparring partner in a week. And this was getting fed back to me. And I'm like, he does realise it's an exhibition. He does realise I'm a journalist. Like, what the hell is going on? And obviously, the reason he didn't want to come face to face with me was he knew he couldn't keep the facade going. He knew that he would break down or whatever it was. Now, the weird thing was, I'm watching Rocky movies and I'm running at 4:00 in the morning and I'm obsessed now and I can't get him out my head. And I feel, to me, this is a real fight now. Oh my God. I've got to use my height, my reach now. I've got to keep my hands up, use that jab. And it is me running at 4 in the morning, actually trying to convince myself I can outbox a former world champion on my debut. And it was just mental. And then one day I was out having a run one morning and he drove past me in the car. And afterwards he said, I waved and then dropped my hand because I was like, oh shit, I'm not supposed to be waving to him. I'm supposed to be, because the whole point was Shay Neary, and afterwards we had a beer afterwards and he said, I wanted you to experience what professional fighters experience. Those nerves, that feeling of I'm going to get knocked out and then humiliate myself in the first minute in front of all these people, my friends, my family, everything. I'm going to get humiliated. Every fighter has these thoughts going through the mind. He said, I didn't want you to be all happy and smiley with me going, oh, it's only an exhibition, and taking it lightly and not doing your runs at 4 in the morning and not thinking staying up at night and not watching Rocky movies and fucking doing 200 press-ups, because that's what we do. That's what boxers go through. So he made me experience that. But the fight itself, and I've got it on DVD, I need to put it up on YouTube because it is amazing. Just to share the ring with someone like that. And he makes his ring walk and he's fired up to fuck, and the Irish Rover's playing, and it's Pink Floyd first, then the Irish Rover. It's the same ring walk that I'd covered so many times from ringside, and here he is marching to fight me. It was incredible. And that was the moment out of that whole year of competing, playing packed cash in front of hundreds of fans in the bleachers, and playing rugby league in front of an almost capacity stadium and everything else, didn't even come close to the energy dump I had watching him make that ring walk. I was the fittest I'd ever been in my entire life, and ever will have been, in that moment, standing in that ring waiting for Shane Neary. And I'd never felt so exhausted in my life, and he still hadn't got in the ring. The adrenaline dump was frightening, absolutely frightening. And then first round, just to quickly talk you through it, first round, he's just ducking and weaving and bobbing and stuff like that, and I'm slowly getting me confidence up, throwing a jab, couple of jabs and moving around. And minutes in, I'm thinking, actually, this is not too bad. He's a bit apprehensive as the old man. He doesn't want to let it go. And he's kind of pushing me around the ring. Obviously, at the time, I'm thinking, I am doing all right here. I can't believe how well this is going. I can't believe how easy I can just push him away with that jab, and I keep resetting him. And so it gets cocky, don't I? Tries to follow a double jab up with the right hand. And as I threw the right hand, he literally just kind of looked at it, sail past his face, just casually just watched it breeze past. This is for me, this is like split second. But for him, it's probably like, I'll just watch that right hand go wide past me ear. And then he just dropped his shoulder and give me a little bump, little blow, a little left hook to the kidneys. And I thought in that moment, when you go like, it's like getting hit in the balls with a football where you just go, and it feels like you've held your breath for an hour. And I'm like, and the referee, obviously, he knew he caught me. Shay knew he caught me. So Shay takes a backward step. And the referee come in and he kind of put me up against the ropes to stop me fucking going over. And I just remember the referee. So to everyone else, the referee looks like he's about to give me a count or whatever it may be. And the crowd's erupted by now. Oh, Jimmy's back. He's got him. Ah! But the referee's looking at me and the referee's going, just breathe, son. Just breathe, son. Just breathe. And thankfully, eventually you go, you get that shot of air in. Obviously, and I managed to get through that round. Second round comes out. And we're going at it again. And he just completely upped the pace. And he just outworked me. And he peppered me with shots. And, just really, I felt like what it feels like to be in there. He really gave me that full experience. Obviously, he was pulling his punches. Of course he was. Former world champion, but he gave me that experience. And then I come out for the third round, absolutely spent, survival mode. Oh my goodness, this is amazing, but this is as terrifying as I thought it was going to be. And as we leaned in to touch gloves, he just whispered in my ear, "Come at me now." And I knew that in that moment, I thought, all right, okay, he's gonna, I can unload now. And he did. To be fair, he slipped. He was just slipping and moving, and he was enjoying himself, and it became brilliant then, because I knew then, because in your mind you're like, I'm surviving, this is all. But in that moment you're like, okay, it is what it is. I'm in here with a former world champion. I'm gonna fucking enjoy this now. And obviously, if you see it, that third round, I just throw everything. I'm throwing uppercuts and bolo shots and like trying to get everything off everything. 10 years of being a boxing journalist. I've been a frustrated fan sitting at ringside. I let it all out in that 3 minutes. Like all them fights where you go, oh, why doesn't he just do that? Or, tuck up and throw this. In that moment, I just did the lot. I just did everything. And Shane Neary was sensationally ducked and weaved a lot of it. And it was literally one of the greatest moments and the greatest nights of my life. Very lucky.
I think you've spoken about it on the Fight Disciples before. Are you still looking at hopefully trying to take the John McCarthy command, referee and judges course? Yeah,
I think I'm just waiting for Mark Goddard, obviously with lockdown at the moment. I would love to do the referee and the MMA judging course, just because, the unified rules, because it is so cross-cultural, there is so many ways. There's so many ways to judge a fight. I feel like judging an MMA fight is so much more difficult than judging a boxing fight, because there's 2 extra minutes, and also there's so many different facets as well. In boxing, there's only a certain number of punches you can actually throw, and they either land or they don't. But in MMA, there's so many more grappling positions. There's so many. I've never wrestled competitively. I'm not a jiu-jitsu belt. I'm not a belted jiu-jitsu player. So there's certain part of my view as a spectator that I feel is inhibited by my lack of participation in certain aspects of MMA. And listen, 10 years of sitting cage side and speaking to people and learning the technical nuances from a fan's perspective has certainly given me a strong perception of what's going on. But I just think there's nothing better than getting down there, getting on the mats, and spending time with people like Mark, who I've got so much admiration for, that were in this sport when it was cage fighting, long before mixed martial arts, long before the UFC were what they are now. He was in it because he loved it back then. And so to be able to spend some one-on-one time with him and to learn how he would judge a fight, how he refs a fight, I think there's a lot of... I think I'd be surprised. My opinions are probably off target. Even though I've read the unified rules of MMA, I think the way I judge a fight now is probably very different. And I know it is from speaking to judges, the way the rule book says you should judge a fight. But, all I can do is call it. It's like boxing. I call it how I see it. If I think a guy's won that round because I think he's been more aggressive or he's controlled the pace or whatever, I'm going to say it how I see it. And MMA doesn't quite work like that. There's too many nuances in MMA that it's not that clear cut. It's not just the aggressor. It's not just the guy who's landing the most punches. It's, it could be the guy that, advances certain submissions, in a certain period, or manages a number of takedowns and actually develops from those takedowns rather than the 2.5 minutes of glorious boxing that the other guy did. There's still those nuances that I would love to, just be better at my job at judging fights. That's all it's about, me getting better.
Would you do like a behind the scenes diary? Because I know it's 3 days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if Mark would allow me to, obviously it's part of Mark's deal with IMAF, but also it's a way that Mark obviously makes his living in the sport. So I would love to do a diary like that with Mark, and maybe that's something I'll speak to him about. In fact, I'll probably speak to Dan Hardy and maybe do a video diary on Fight Disciples and the Raptors platform as well, Dan's own platform, because those guys are very much ingrained, and I know they'd be interested in taking some content like that. So yeah, man, definitely. I'll definitely pitch that one to Mark.
You'd like to quickly get the ESPN released 10 can't miss fights for 2020. If we quickly get your review,
yeah,
we've kind of gone longer than we expected.
Yeah.
Lomachenko Lopez.
Love the fight. You can't deny Lopez has got balls. But I genuinely think Lomachenko is a once-a-lifetime fighter, and I can't look back Loma. My old mate from 2008, I can't look past Loma. And I don't think anybody at this weight division or below can touch him. I think the only way Lomachenko gets beat is if he moves up another weight division or two, and ultimately just gets beaten by a much taller, bigger, stronger individual. I just think, for me, he's the best of this generation. Technically, the best of this generation. Potentially the best, technically, of all time.
Jamel Charlo against Derevyanchenko.
Yeah, I like the fight. I like Derevyanchenko. I think he's game as anything. I'm a huge fan of both the Charlos, though. I won't look past either Charlo. I love that time when they had that run together and they were basically competing against each other for the best knockout. I thought that was glorious. So yeah, I'm going to go with both Charlos on this occasion. I know they're both matched up, aren't they? So as usual with the Charlos, when you put them close together, it's a competition to score the best knockout. So
next one is Ryan Garcia, Luke Campbell.
Yeah, I spoke to Luke. I had them on the podcast just the other day about it, and he's absolutely game for the fight. I think Ryan Garcia is a lot better than people give him credit for, because he is this social media persona first and foremost. Oh, that's exactly what it feels like. But I think his last two performances, man, have been cold, hard killer performances. Like those two knockouts were absolutely glorious, and he absolutely backs it up. So as much as I like Ryan Garcia, I'm going to have to stick with Luke Campbell. I think experience counts. I think Campbell can drag him into deep water and outbox him. But man, that kid's got a baby face, but he can punch like a freight train.
Errol Spence, Danny Garcia.
Yeah. Listen, I'm not... Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't be a huge fan of the fight, because I just want to see Errol Spence fight Terence Crawford. And until that fight happens, I refuse to get animated about either. It's just like the Kell Brook fight. I can't get excited about it, with all due respect to Kell. And I love the fact that Kell's got this opportunity, of course. But until Errol Spence fights Terence Crawford, that's the ultimate question mark, isn't it? So this is an in-house PBC fight. It is what it is. It's to be expected. If Errol Spence is 90% of the man he was before he almost killed himself, then I don't think he'll have too much trouble with Danny Garcia. He'll have more trouble with Garcia's dad probably in the build-up.
Daniel Dubois, Joe Joyce.
Well, as Fight Disciples listeners will know, we talk about fighters that we've been banging a drum about for a long time. Daniel Dubois, go back Fight Disciples from 3 years ago, and I will say, you'll hear me say then, I truly believe Daniel Dubois will become undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. I think he's got one of the most exciting prospects in all of world boxing in any weight division. I think he's absolutely the truth. And as much as I like Joe Joyce as a person and the team around him, I think he's a great guy, and I love the fact he'll fight anyone and his mentality. I just think he's too slow and too cumbersome, too easy to hit. And I think Daniel Dubois will stop him in sensational fashion as well. Be the first man to do it.
Gervonta Davis, Leo Santa Cruz. Wonderful
fight for Gervonta. Leo Santa Cruz, the timing's everything in this sport. And I think Leo Santa Cruz just, there's just signs there now that he's on his way out of the sport. Timing's everything. I think Tank's just too aggressive, too powerful. I love the fact he's kind of gone back with Mayweather, because there was a moment there where he was just following that Adrian Broner path, and I feared for him. I feared for his future, but thankfully it looks like he's back on track now, and a focused and in camp and a dedicated Tank could be the man. He could be the man. He could be a multiple belt, multiple weight world champion. He's a miniature Mike Tyson when he's on his day. So I'm going to go with Tank with that one. But please just stay away from the problem. There's only one Adrian Broner. We don't need another one.
Recently announced Inoue, the monster, against Jason Maloney.
Yeah, man. Is that like the worst phone call in the world ever? You know what I mean? If you're Jason Maloney, that is like, what have I done to you, Bob? What have I done to you? What have I done to you to deserve this? Nobody wants to fight the monster. Guy is freakishly powerful. Absolutely a joy to watch. And I can see him becoming a huge superstar. And, I'm guaranteed right now, he's probably taken English lessons as much as he has boxing lessons, if not more, because he's got the potential to be the next Manny Pacquiao. I truly believe that. He's got the kind of power that can move up through weight divisions. And it's been an absolute pleasure to watch. It was amazing to have him on British shores for the World Boxing Super Series, which has been, absolutely incredible for boxing, I think. I was such a fan of that tournament. We had so many amazing fights, and it was doing the one thing that us boxing fans want. It was presenting us with one weight division, one champion. And, I hope World Boxing Super Series manages to recover from COVID, because we need it. We need it in the sport. And that was the first time when really the world got to see what Inoue is all about. And yeah, man, that is not going 4 rounds. Sorry.
Another fight that probably won't go many rounds. Miguel Berchelt against Oscar Valdez.
Yeah, man. I'm super excited for the fight because I'm a huge fan. But yeah, man, that's, what is it? 3 rounds, 4 rounds. There's a decent little accumulator here actually, because there's quite a few finishes there. I think Errol Spence turns up. I think he finishes Garcia as well. So of all these 10 fights made, there's not many I can see actually going the distance.
And then lastly, you've got obviously the rematch, Povetkin and Dylan White.
Yeah, well, you can only judge a man by his last performance, and Povetkin proved that experience counts for everything. Suddenly Dillian White, as great as he looked, and he did look great up until the start of that 5th round. He hadn't really put a foot wrong. He had a magnificent 4th round, and we were doing live commentary for it, myself and Adam. And coming out for that 5th round, I was talking. I said, it's shit or bust time now for Povetkin. This is the end of his career. If he gets finished now, his career's over. That's the shit. There's no coming back from this. There's no world title campaign after this. He's too long in the tooth. He's too old now. Too many controversies. Too many failed drug tests. Too much water under the bridge. It's the end. Dillian White's going to end his career right now. And that corner team had the easiest job in the world, because that's all they reiterated to him. If you want to continue doing this, if you want to continue boxing, you got to get out there and you got to put it on this guy. And in that moment, that crisis moment, that moment where he's picked himself up off the floor twice, once quite heavily, his back's against the wall, his career's on the line, that's when you revert to type. That's when you revert to your pedigree. That's when years of just being an amateur, up and down, all over the world, at every level, doing this from the age of, 5 or 6 years old or whatever it was with Povetkin, such a young age. Very much a product of that Russian factory line of amateur boxing talent that all came in with that one shot that he absolutely picked perfectly, that he'd shown feints for previously, that he'd worked for that opening. He delivered that punch perfectly on the chin. So I think now going into the second fight, Povetkin's going to have a whole different level of confidence. It doesn't matter whether it's in Eddie's back garden no more. He knows if he wins this fight, he gets an opportunity, more than likely gets an opportunity to fight for the world title in the next 12 months. And Dillian Whyte, the pressure's on now, baby. Because if he doesn't win this, if you will lose a second fight against Povetkin, man, it's going to be tough. Listen, one thing I've always done over 20 years, I'm always reluctant to retire any man who's still young enough and competitive in boxing. Crack on, but it's going to be hard for him to get back to the level he's at or was at prior to the loss to Povetkin if he loses again. You can forget about fighting for the world title for the next couple of years for sure.
And I think what all the fight disciples are probably wondering, Nick, is this year, will we see the famous Snake Bike Sunday?
Yeah. I hope so. We had we've just been locked down in the UK again, so we're restricted to 6 people maximum in social circles from Monday, bizarrely, which is great because it's my nephew's 18th birthday on tomorrow night. So thankfully, the family party hasn't had to be cancelled. But how ridiculous is that? But yeah, we're just gonna have to wait and see. We had hoped to take Fight Disciples on the road this year as well. We had conversations about doing some live shows, getting some fighters on stages at different venues, and with our Proper Tackle beer, that's flowing really well at the moment. We were going to do some live events and give away some beer and get it on drafts in bars, and go to Cardiff with Joe Calzaghe and Manchester with Ricky Hatton, and get up and down the country and get on the ale basically with Fight Disciples fans and really have a good time. But obviously that's all completely on the back burner now. We'll just have to wait and see. The world's a weird place right now, Mike, and who knows whether we're even going to be able to sit ringside again or cage side again before the year's out. Hopefully there's a potential of us going out to Abu Dhabi for the Khabib fight next month, which would be amazing. I would jump at the opportunity to do that, but that's only because the UFC have such stringent COVID restrictions, and they're able to put some all the kind of stuff in place. But I can't wait to be in an arena that's full of fans at a fight again. That is something I'm so looking forward to. And right here, right now, who knows whether that's going to be this year or even next year. I'm a blind optimist. I'd like to think it'll happen before the year's out, but let's be honest, if this thing second spikes, then it ain't going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that we'll get something, because the NFL obviously started last night and they had, I think, 17,000 in attendance. And the Bob Arum, he kind of said that the Tyson Fury Wilder 3 fight might be in Vegas at the Allegiant Stadium. And I think they were hoping for like 20% attendance. So,
amazing.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. But Nick, thanks for coming on today, and the floor is yours. If you want to tell people where they can find you on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Yeah, man. Well, you can come at us on Twitter and Facebook. We're at Fight Disciples. Instagram is at The Fight Disciples. I'm across all those platforms as well. My Twitter handle is PT_editor. And yeah, that's the best place to hit us up, really, in terms of content, whether it be BT or Fight Disciples, or whether some written word stuff that I'm doing for various different partners now as well. So yeah, man, hit us up, get involved, get us part of the debate, and don't be afraid of casuals, man. We were all casuals once, and the more casuals that watch fight sports, the better for everybody, because casuals bring eyeballs brings money brings bigger prestige, money brings better fighters, bigger platforms. The casual is the most important fan in and around fight sports. So instead of using it as a stick to beat one another over, let's embrace the fact and let's get as many people watching fight sports as we can. Yeah, exactly. And you can find us at The Last Round 12 on Twitter and Instagram. And me and Danny Z will be back on Sunday to preview and review the fights. This is The Last Round.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is The Last Round